reports of damage. Dolby, okay. Dolby. What did I say? Doobie. Thank you. Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. The British Prime Minister announces a 4-point plan to support Ukraine and help them plan for peace, calling on Europe to provide the heavy lifting. President Zelenskyy thanks the US for its support following that fiery exchange in the Oval Office as he warns Russia to stop targeting Ukraine if they want talks. Cryptocurrency prices rise as President Trump announces a new US strategic reserve. And Anora bags 5 gongs, including Best Picture, Best Director and Best Actress at this year's Academy Awards. To our top story, and the UK Prime Minister has announced a 4-point plan to support Ukraine in ending the war against Russia. So Keir Starmer announced a coalition of the willing a day after Zelenskyy's meeting at the White House. Starmer called a summit of 18 leaders, including French President Emmanuel Macron, to step up their efforts.
The discussions we've had today, particularly the coalition of the willing, is on the basis that this is a plan that we will work with the US and that it will have US backing. So that is the purpose of the plan, and that is why I spoke to President Trump last night before we developed the work on this plan. The whole point of a guarantee for any deal, or if there is a deal, is to preserve the peace. And if you want to preserve the peace, you have to be prepared to defend the peace. So the reason I've been forward-leaning on this is because I want to avoid conflict, because I do not want conflict in Ukraine, in Europe, and certainly not in the United Kingdom.
We can now go live to London to speak to our correspondent, Ollie Barrett. Ollie, hello, I hope you're doing well. After Zelenskyy's fiery meeting at the Oval Office on Friday, let's be honest, Keir Starmer seems to have come out of this as the diplomatic hero. Tell us what is included in his 4-point plan.
Well, Leigh Ann, certainly Keir Starmer is trying to present himself as a key diplomatic figure here. He wants the UK to be this so-called bridge between Europe and the United States. And after that fallout in the talks with Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Donald Trump on Friday, Keir Starmer was very quickly onto the telephone with both Presidents Trump and Zelenskyy. He spoke to President Trump again over the weekend, of course, entertained President Zelenskyy here. And in that 4-point peace plan that Keir Starmer has set out, first of all, in his words, he says we must keep the military aid to Ukraine flowing, while also, he says, keeping economic pressure on Russia. Point 2 is that any lasting peace, he says, must guarantee the sovereignty and security of Ukraine. But he also says Ukraine has to be at the table for any peace talks about Ukraine. Number 3, if there is a peace deal, he says that allies will continue to boost Ukraine's defences and deterrence. And 4th is that coalition of the willing that you were talking about, this idea that the UK and some other countries are prepared to put boots in the ground and planes in the air, according to Keir Starmer from the UK's perspective, to police any peace deal that is reached between Russia and Ukraine.
Indeed, Ollie, there's also an additional £1.6 billion of UK export finances and a £2.2 billion loan for military aid. Starmer's using these profits from frozen Russian assets to fund this. Could we see this eventually happen in the United States rather than this minerals deal, which appears to sort of be on and off, on and off?
Well, on the point of the minerals deal, the UK is still hopeful that it can persuade the United States and Ukraine back to negotiations and back towards a signature on that arrangement. And when it comes to frozen Russian assets, Keir Starmer has actually just been asked about this in the House of Commons, where he's been updating British parliamentarians on the summit at the weekend and on his visit to Washington the week before. And he says that the UK is now able to use the interest on frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine, but actually seizing those frozen Russian assets remains a more complicated issue, he says, and that's a similar position from some other European countries as well. We know that in the US there is a keenness, a desire from some American politicians and officials in the Trump administration for the Europeans to do much more in that regard, to use some of those frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine and try and release and reduce the burden on the United States. But as Keir Starmer has been telling his MPs in the House of Commons this afternoon, and opposition MPs as well, actually taking those Russian assets is something that's being worked on, but still considered to be legally difficult at this point.
Yes, indeed. And you mentioned Starmer said the UK would back its commitment with boots on the ground and planes in the air, but Europe must do the heavy lifting. Macron is clearly on board, but will Starmer be able to convince other European leaders despite the UK leaving the EU?
Well, there are some very different positions on this among European Union countries and non-EU European countries as well. George Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, has seemed very sceptical, for example, about sending Italian troops in that way. Poland has sounded sceptical about using Polish troops in that way. The UK and France say they would be prepared to put boots on the ground, and we understand there are several other countries who might be moving in that direction as well. But what the UK is hoping is that it can encourage European countries in different ways to boost Ukraine's defences in the event of a peace deal. And so that will, in turn, he hopes, encourage the Americans to provide some kind of backstop to the deal. That is something that the US President Donald Trump has sounded reluctant about, as have some of his closest advisers and officials. But the UK believes that if Europe can show that it is pulling its weight, then Donald Trump is more likely to provide in some form an American backstop. What that backstop actually looks like from the Americans still remains to be seen. There are various ways it could happen, various different modes that could be used. But the UK is trying to spearhead the European moves to greater defence spending, greater defence capabilities, but also commitments to Ukraine, as I say, to try and encourage the Americans that they should be providing some kind of backstop to a peace deal in that scenario as well.
Ollie Barrett in London, thank you so much for joining me. Now, staying with Ukraine and asking what happens now with peace negotiations and that minerals deal with the US after President Zelenskyy left the White House following that heated discussion with President Trump and J.D. Vance and was accused of being disrespectful in front of the world's media. The minerals deal did remain unsigned. However, it's believed he's still ready to agree a deal with the US. Speaking on X, Zelenskyy thanked the US for its support. Here's what he had to say.
Of course, we understand the importance of America, and we are grateful for all the support we have received from the United States. There hasn't been a single day when we haven't felt grateful, because this is gratitude for the preservation of our independence. Our resilience in Ukraine is built upon what our partners do for us and for their own security. We need peace, not endless war. And this is why we say that security guarantees are the key to this. In the near future, all of us in Europe will share our common positions, the lines we must achieve and the lines we cannot compromise on. These positions will be presented to our partners in the United States.
I'm now joined by John Kavulik, Senior Editor for Outcome Modelling Analysis at Issue Insight. Great to speak to you again, John. So Volodymyr Zelenskyy says continued attacks show Moscow does not want to end the war with Ukraine. Is he actually correct in his analysis here?
No, because neither the armed forces of the Russian Federation nor the armed forces of Ukraine are stopping the fighting. And so to sort of equate or conflate the fact that the Russian government will say, well, we're interested in what President Trump is doing vis-a-vis ceasefire, vis-a-vis bringing the war to the end, but we're still going to continue to fight. And so, I don't take much from that in that it's a demonstration of not wanting peace, because neither side wants to give an advantage to the other side until they absolutely have to. And that is why President Trump is singularly, linearly focused on the ceasefire, because for him, everything comes from the ceasefire. It's sort of reversed what people have now, which is they're talking about the peace plan, just and lasting peace, security guarantees, boots on the ground. President Trump is saying, okay, that's fine, but first they have to stop shooting at one another. And that's where his singular focus is.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it's something that Zelenskyy says a ceasefire won't work. He wants peace, and that's all he's sort of looking for. As we saw that reaction in the White House and the Oval Office to both the men talking about this exact issue. But, John, I just want to ask, what was your reaction to the last 48 hours since that explosive meeting between President Trump, Vice President Vance and Zelenskyy, and then the European nations really rallying around a wounded Zelenskyy?
Friday was... It has a lot of adjectives, a lot of adverbs. It's almost become a noun now. Did you get a Friday? It wasn't a good look for President Zelenskyy, and for some, it wasn't a good look for President Trump. However, President Zelenskyy went off script, and he created the moment that we all saw. All he had to do, and he was advised to do, his teams were advised. So it wasn't that, oh, no one told us that we shouldn't do this. But he was advised, go in, sit down. When the media spray, when the pool's brought in, you lean over to President Trump, you put your hand on his shoulder, and you say, Mr. President, I want to thank you, thank the American people, thank the American taxpayers, thank the Congress for the support you've given us, the support you gave us before 2022 with the javelins. You've been there for us, and we're really hopeful that now that you're energized and you're back in the White House, that you're going to be with us again. And I look forward, our teams look forward to talking to you once we're away from the media and try to work on some more things that you can make happen. End of story. That's all he had to say. The media would have gone out. Trump would have been happy, but he didn't, and he couldn't. And that's why where we are. Then you move to Prime Minister Starmer, who grabbed an opportunity to his credit, and he worked it on Saturday. They had that pre-planned gathering on Sunday, and they've created this, what we'll call the coalition of the willing. But when it comes to Europe, and when it comes to Europe actually doing something, there's always great distance between rhetoric and actually doing it. For one example, the boots on the ground component, that will cost an average of about $141,000 a year per soldier. Now, some months ago, President Zelenskyy said that in order to sustain a peace deal, to make a ceasefire work, to move toward a just and lasting peace, he was going to need 220,000 troops on the ground, that would be about $52 billion a year. And how long would they need to be there? And when President Zelenskyy and others say we can't trust President Putin, that he's violated all the other agreements that we've ever had, which is true. However, President Trump comes in and says, well, wait a minute. That was then. This is now. He's never lied to me. He has never done anything to me. Therefore, I start with him at 100%. And that's a big problem for President Zelenskyy and the Europeans, because they start with Putin underground in terms of credibility. But for President Trump, Putin's at the top of the heap. So therefore, Putin has to do something to prove President Trump wrong. And that's why President Trump is willing to say, I want the ceasefire. Eventually, I want to be able to say to Vladimir Putin at 12:01 on March or something, 2025, I need you to stop firing into Ukraine. Then President Trump will go to Zelenskyy. President Zelenskyy, I want you to stop firing into Russia. They've got the ceasefire. And from President Trump's standpoint, he's almost done with it at that point because he's brought peace. Handsome young men, as he has said, are not dying anymore. So I don't know, how much Prime Minister Starmer is going to be able to move all of the rhetoric and the good feelings from Sunday into actually getting Europeans, getting a majority of the EU, a majority of NATO to actually do something.
So, John,
absent President Trump doing something.
Apologies for that. But yes, as you said, President Trump wants peace. He might also want the Nobel Peace Prize, we must remember. But Russia has reacted to the exchange for the first time. They've accused Zelenskyy of a complete lack of diplomatic ability. You sort of alluded to this earlier. It also says a fragmentation of the West has begun. Does Russia now have the upper hand in these negotiations, especially with Donald Trump?
I can see where you're going with that, and I can see the basis for that logic, but I would say no. President Trump this isn't a guy that's sort of Kissinger-esque or Churchill-esque in terms of reading and absorbing the history and looking at a multi-layer chess game. He's just linear, pretty straight, transactional, like a real estate guy. And so when he's looking at, what can I do? And this is a big part of the divide between, let's say, Europe and the government of Ukraine and the Trump-Vance administration. The Trump-Vance administration is saying, what can we control and what can't we control? Now, if we want a ceasefire, if that's the first stage, if that's the main building block upon which everything else will happen, the just and lasting peace, dealing with reparations, dealing with territorial negotiation, all of that stuff. First, they have to stop killing one another for however long that takes. So when he looks at that, he'll say, well, in order for me to deliver, I have to only focus on what I can control. Now, if there's a ceasefire, can Trump control the Russians rearming, regrouping, resting, etc.? No. Can he do the same thing in Ukraine? No. So we know both countries are going to use that time for however advantage they can, but he can't control it. But there's one thing that he believes he can control, and that is a deal with President Putin to stop the firing, a deal with Zelenskyy to stop the firing, and then it sort of pivots to Prime Minister Starmer and pivots to Europe, pivots to the European Union that, okay, guys, I've stopped the fighting. Donald Trump has given you the opening. Now, what are you going to do with it? And the result will be no one is going to be happy. And I think that's really important for everyone to remember in this. The Ukrainian government's not going to be happy with the outcome. The Russian government's not going to be happy with the outcome. President Trump's not going to be overly enthusiastic about the outcome, but he'll be happy enough to be able to take credit for it. And that's where we're going to be for quite a while.
Absolutely. John Kavalik, thank you so much for your insights. Absolutely fascinating. And I hope to have you back on the show very soon. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. The UN and several Arab states, including Egypt and Qatar, have condemned Israel for blocking humanitarian aid from entering the Gaza Strip. They say the move violates the ceasefire deal. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said it was enforced because Hamas was stealing the supplies and using them to finance its terror machine. A Hamas spokesman said Israel's blockade was a coup against the ceasefire agreement. A major operation is now underway in western Germany after a vehicle drove into a crowd of people in the city of Mannheim. One person is dead and several others are seriously injured. Police have cordoned off part of the city centre. The incident comes weeks after 2 people were killed in a similar incident in Munich. A 3.9 magnitude earthquake hit Hollywood as some of its biggest stars celebrated the Oscars last night. The earthquake's epicenter was in North Hollywood, a short distance from where the ceremony was hosted at the Dolby Theatre. There was no immediate reports of any damage or injuries. The US will start levying tariffs on Canada and Mexico from tomorrow, according to Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. It's not clear whether US President Donald Trump will stick with the promised 25%. Speaking to Fox News, Lutnick said that the two countries had done a reasonable job securing their borders with the US, the key point of contention between the countries. Now, President Donald Trump briefly sent the prices of 5 cryptocurrencies soaring, but they are already coming back down to earth. Over the weekend, Trump said the US will start investing in cryptocurrencies, news which led to a surge in the markets. Bitcoin finally broke the bearish trend and skyrocketed back above $90,000 mark. Ethereum followed, climbing over $2,500. Writing on Truth Social, the president said a U.S. crypto reserve will elevate this critical industry after years of corrupt attacks by the Biden administration. I will make sure the U.S. is the crypto capital of the world. We are making America great again. For more on this, I'm happy to say I'm joined by Daniel LaCall, Chief Economist at Trezors. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me this evening. So this investment in cryptocurrency, a promise Donald Trump made, of course, during his election campaign. He's even launched his own crypto coins. Tell us how this new U.S. strategic crypto reserve is actually going to work, because there has been some skepticism about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that this is basically about strengthening the US dollar as the world reserve currency and embracing the reality of independent units of currency. So instead of trying to ban it or trying to put brakes to innovation, what the Trump administration is trying to do is to make the most out of this surge in new and possible independent currencies, understanding that the environment for some of the global fiat currencies is very, very challenging, considering the fiscal and monetary issues. So the way that it would work is relatively simple. It would be to dedicate a relatively large amount of funds to a fund that would invest in those crypto assets with the idea of building the same as some other countries have, for example, with gold or with silver. So a strategic reserve that could be used in the future to strengthen the US dollar and the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, for example. Or as well to strengthen the position of the United States as the place to invest and to create hubs of crypto assets. It's basically the vision of the current Secretary of State of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, who, instead of being a radical denier or person against Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, has always understood that these are warning signs to fiat currencies. So the US dollar, as a global leader, is looking at crypto assets instead of as a threat, as something that they want to strengthen and that they want to take advantage and benefit from.
Well, the Federal Reserve backed this idea if this does happen, because we have to be realistic. We always see Bitcoin as being quite volatile, and we've seen that over the last week. Can we expect Bitcoin to keep rising, and where does this sort of leave people who are invested in it?
I think it's a very good question, because a lot of people look at the possibility of the United States increasing its position or building a position in crypto assets as something that is going to make the price of the underlying asset go up. And this is not the way it works. If you think, for example, of the strategic reserve of oil that the United States owns, that does not increase the price of oil when they're replenishing it, and it certainly does sometimes bring the price relatively lower for a short period of time when they are actually releasing those strategic reserves. And that's the objective. The objective is exactly the same. It's not to bring the price of the underlying asset up, which may happen for numerous other reasons. Investor demand, strengthening of their positioning as units of measure and methods of payment, but the objective of the strategic reserve is actually almost the opposite of bringing the price up. It's basically taking advantage of when the price is not particularly high in order to build that strategic reserve and using it, if ever needed, to continue to strengthen the position of the US dollar as the world reserve currency. So, on the one hand, it is a validation of crypto assets as let's say, contenders in the monetary world, but it does not necessarily mean that this will lead the price higher, and definitely it should not. What we want, any investor actually in Bitcoin or in any other crypto asset would want, is actually for the price to go up because of global demand, not just because one purchaser, in this case the United States, is sort of inflating it artificially.
Absolutely. Daniel, just one quick question, if you've got time. Trump is hosting the first White House Crypto Summit. That's happening on Friday. And what can we expect from that? And what will investors actually be hoping for?
I think it's important for this idea that President Trump has of the United States becoming the world capital of crypto assets. It's a validation of a completely different and sometimes ignored and many times rejected new way of understanding monetary elements. We are used to talking about central banks and states issuing currency, etc. And what we are living now is a revolution that is very, very difficult to predict. But what the Trump administration seems to be wanting to do is to lead that innovation and technological revolution instead of just trying to ban it or trying to ignore it. Because if they want, and it's one of the main elements of the Trump campaign, was one of the elements of the Trump campaign to strengthen the US dollar as the world reserve currency, the leader should not be afraid of competition. And I think that that is precisely what they want to do. What they want to do is for investors globally to think of the United States as the place that defends, strengthens, and develops the crypto world instead of trying to ban it or ignore it. And at the same time, show the world that the United States dollar is not worried about crypto assets, that a leader does not worry about competition, actually allows it to thrive.
Daniel Lacal, Chief Economist at Tresis. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for speaking to me this evening.
Thank you very much.
Now, the world's biggest showbiz stars gathered in Hollywood last night for the 97th Academy Awards. As always, it was a memorable occasion with the film Anora announced as the big winner of the night, picking up 5 Oscars, including Best Picture. Let's take a look.
And the Oscar goes to? Are they playing us off?
No. Well, maybe. Anora.
We made this with very little money, but all of our hearts. To all of the dreamers and the young filmmakers out there, tell the stories you want to tell. Tell the stories that move you. I promise you, you will never regret it.
One last thing, I want to thank the Academy for recognizing a truly independent film. This film was made on the blood, sweat, and tears of incredible indie artists.
Let's go live to Los Angeles now to speak to entertainment reporter Emily Evans. Emily, it was Anora's night, as we've just seen, but it also caused a little bit of an upset as its star Mikey Madison won Best Actress over Demi Moore, who had been the clear frontrunner for the award.
Yes, I mean, the thing is, Demi has been an actor and been in the industry for 45 years. So I think a lot of people are just feeling that she's been robbed due to maybe the time she's been in the industry over Mikey, that's only 25 years old. But overall, Anora was the main winner all round. So it's strange because Demi won the SAG Award, and normally whoever wins the SAG Award goes on to win the Oscar. But as I said, Anora, across the board, won everything. So it's no surprise, but Demi's fans are not happy.
Oh my gosh, I just think I absolutely love Demi Moore. I was rooting for her, but not that I'm biased at all. But Kieran Culkin also continued his award season winning streak, didn't he, for his role in A Real Pain. His speech really surprised his wife. I actually thought it was quite cute.
I mean, I don't know why his wife gets surprised, because for me, one of my favorite things of awards season recently is Kieran Culkin's speeches. It's just, what's he going to do next? So yes, his wife, and they just met them on the carpet yesterday. They are just adorable as he was in his speech about her. They're like that in person, and she's just wonderful. But yes, he basically asked his wife to give him, it was a running joke that if he won an Emmy, that she would let him have another child. But if he got an Oscar, that he would get another 2 children, so 4 kids in total. And he decided to tell the whole world about it, much to his wife's amusement. So maybe 2 more kids for Kieran Culkin coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. Another key moment was when Adrian Brody won his award for Best Actor, The Brutalist. But what happened there? There was a little bit of a scandal with some chewing gum.
Yes, I mean, again, Kieran did a funny moment with chewing gum at the Golden Globes, and that was kind of funny, passing it to Jessie. But he did it nicely when Adrian was going up the steps to get onto stage and decided to throw his chewing gum at his partner. So I don't know, was he trying to be funny again, or was it slightly disrespectful? I don't know. I feel he could have swallowed it.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. I could agree with you too. I think you should have done that. You were actually on the red carpet speaking to some of the stars, and some of the fashion was absolutely fascinating. I thought some people looked pretty amazing. Who do you think really stood out last night on the red carpet?
For me, Michelle Yeoh was just classic and beautiful in her blue dress. But I love a royal blue colour, wearing that myself right now. Also, Demi, I mean, she looked absolutely stunning. And Halle Berry, her mirrored dress was just wonderful. A lot has been said about Ariana Grande's dress, but she, to me, looked a bit like a lampshade. But I suppose that's fashion for you, isn't it? So.
Absolutely, Emily, a very pale lampshade. And there was also a special tribute to firefighters following those devastating wildfires. We mustn't forget this in the city earlier this year, wasn't there?
Yeah, and also on the red carpet before as well, what was lovely was we were all interviewing people and they walked on and everyone just started clapping. And I think it's Captain Eric Scott just went bright red, bless him. It was so because it really was an ovation on the red carpet as well. But once again, on stage, they were brought out and a standing ovation, which is obviously absolutely the least they deserve and everything they've done here in Los Angeles.
I must say something. I'm very envious of you being able to go to the red carpet last night. Emily Evans, entertainment reporter in Los Angeles. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
A reminder of our top stories. The British Prime Minister announces a 4-point plan to support Ukraine and help them plan for peace, calling on Europe to provide the heavy lifting. President Zelenskyy thanks the US for its support following that fiery exchange in the Oval Office as he warns Russia to stop targeting Ukraine if they want talks. Cryptocurrency prices rise as President Trump announces a new US strategic reserve. And Anora bags 5 gongs, including Best Picture, Best Director and Best Actress at this year's Academy Awards. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next. And of course, don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. My guest today is someone who's turned controversial conversations on issues such as the woke culture into an art form. The renowned evolutionary behavioral scientist Dr. Gad Saad pulls no punches as he fights for what he believes should be universal truths and real freedom of speech. His best-selling book, The Parasitic Mind, explores how the human thought process can be hijacked by irrational ideas and how these parasitic beliefs shape much of modern society. Professor Saad's upcoming book is called Suicidal Empathy, exploring how excessive compassion for harmful ideologies is threatening much of Western society. Well, his impact and presence on social media has earned him the friendship and support of people such as the world's richest man.
I found him to be incredibly engaging, very, very humble, zero ego, just two guys. We literally hugged. Sat there for 4 hours, completely locked in. You know, he was confiding in me in a very trusting way, in a very intimate way. So I thought he was just absolutely lovely. I mean, he is an eccentric guy, but I've got nothing but positive affection for him.
And Professor Saad has welcomed Donald Trump's second presidency as an opportunity to turn the tide on woke culture and to boost freedom of speech. I caught up with him in his hometown of Montreal in Canada for a candid conversation covering a number of controversial ideas that he's put forward. In this, the first of 2 episodes, Dr. Saad explains what he sees as the real danger of the parasitic mind, his abhorrence of what he calls social justice warriors, and how he justifies his position.
I am putting the epistemological noose around your neck. I don't have to emote louder than you. I don't have to scream louder than you. If I can have this, gargantuan triangulation of evidence, I'll let that do the talking for me.
Professor Gad Saad, technically, but Gad Saad. I'm glad you could spend some time with me for this conversation. There's so much to talk about. I guess I should start by asking, which pronouns would you prefer I use for you?
He, they.
Happy to do that. Now, you've written so many books, well, you've written a number of books, I should say, that really look at the human condition from a number of angles. I'm going to go through a couple of those down the road, but let's start with The Parasitic Mind, because that's the one that really got you out there. And having been through it, I don't know, one sense I got was that you seemed almost angry or frustrated with the way society has gone. Was it essentially a vent?
I mean, in a sense, yes, because having been in academia for for 31 years now, I always tell people I faced two great wars in my life. The first one was the Lebanese Civil War, growing up in Lebanon. The second one was the war on reason, on logic, on common sense, on reality that I saw on university campuses. And I just couldn't understand how supposedly intelligent people could be parasitized by such nonsense. And so it was really a result of me having stood at the top of the mountain, screaming into the wind, nobody paying attention to me. Eventually, they paid attention with The Parasitic Mind.
Isn't a best-selling book in its own way an infectious idea?
It is. So in the mimetic sense, so if you remember, Richard Dawkins famously wrote a book in 1976 called The Selfish Gene. In that book, he argued that, of course, humans are a biological animal, but also a cultural animal. Our genes spread, but so do our memes, which is packets of information. Right. So when you're reading my book, I am literally infecting your brain with my ideas.
Now, you state in the book that people should proactively judge, not just judge simply to be politically correct. Where does that leave someone like me? I'm an old school journalist, and it was kind of beaten into me years ago as I trained that I should not take a position, that I should not be involving myself in the story with adjectives or a commentary or an opinion. All that's changed now in the media, as we know, but I'm kind of stuck in that world. Where does that leave me, where I don't want to be in an argument with you screaming and shouting that you're right or wrong? I just want to hear your opinions,
right,
and let people decide.
So in your case, if you're wearing your hat as a journalist, then perhaps not judging is the right ethos to invoke. But in my case, if I am a creator of truth and a defender of truth, then by definition, I have to judge, right? I mean, I belong to the society of judgment and decision-making as someone who studies psychology of decision-making. So it's perfectly natural to judge. And in the book, I talk about the fact that many people are reticent to judge because they view it as gauche. Who am I to judge? Who are we to judge? Now, that's an injunction from the New Testament, but it refers to not being a moral hypocrite, right? Don't judge others if you are committing the sin yourself. You know, people who cast stones from a glass house and so on. But that doesn't mean that we never judge. I judge those who engage in reprehensible acts. It's perfectly part of our repertoire of human behavior.
Of course, it makes it very difficult for me because I'm kind of stuck in this world where conversations like this normally would involve me trying to catch you out or, you know, trying to have a go at you. But what I want to do is really get the most out of where your mind is and how it works. And I wonder, you know, in the sense that you say in The Parasitic Mind that, you know, we're basically capitulating. We're surrendering our opinions to the woke culture and to political correctness. What's wrong in your mind with that particular approach of at least accepting it?
Right. So each of those parasitic ideas that I talk about in the book, and maybe it's worth that I mention what some of those ideas are.
Please.
So postmodernism is the granddaddy of all parasitic ideas because it purports that there are no universal truths. We are completely shackled by subjectivity, so to speak of an objective truth is completely nonsensical according to the postmodernists. Cultural relativism is an offshoot of that. It says, who are you to judge absolute moral truths, right? If another culture wants to cut off the clitorises of little girls, that's their business. Don't be a cultural imperialist. Social constructivism is another parasitic idea. It basically says we're not biological creatures. Everything is due to social construction. So if Bubba can bench press more than Linda, it must be because his parents taught him to play rough and tumble. It can't be because there are physiological, hormonal, morphological differences between men and women. Now, each of these parasitic ideas originally started off from a noble place. So take, for example, trans activism, right? Yes, of course, trans people should live free of bigotry. That doesn't mean in the service of that goal, we end up murdering and raping truth. So that, yes, if a 6'4" 280-pound guy decides that he's Linda tomorrow, who are you to judge whether he's not really Linda? So no, I do judge people who, in the service of an original noble goal, decide to kill truth.
You see these ideas to explain the parasitic mind as basically parallel to biological parasites.
Exactly. Yeah. So let me give you. Yeah.
Please.
So earlier I mentioned memes. Memes are not the same as the neuroparasitological framework that I took, and let me explain why. A meme could be positively valenced, neutral, or negatively valenced. A parasitic idea is inherently negative, right? And the reason why I chose the neuroparasitological framework comes from the animal kingdom. So in nature, the field of parasitology is the study of host-parasite interactions. So for example, you could be parasitized by a tapeworm that takes over your intestinal tract. A neuroparasite is one that seeks to end up in the host's brain, altering its neuronal circuitry to suit its reproductive interests. So for example, a wood cricket abhors water. When it is parasitized by a hairworm, the hairworm needs it to jump into water in order to complete its reproductive cycle. And so that was my epiphany. Aha, I will now use that framework to argue that human beings could be parasitized by actual physical brainworms, but also ideological brainworms, and hence the parasitic mind.
Why do you think humans are so vulnerable to these idea pathogens?
Well, I love that you asked it that way, because I've often been asked, is the parasitic mind something that is specific to the current period? And my answer is no. The capacity for the human mind to be parasitized is an indelible part of the architecture of the human mind. What is specific to the current period are the specific parasitic ideas that are taking over. 300 years ago, it was perfectly a good idea, if we thought that our neighbor Linda was a witch, to throw her into the body of water. And if she swims, then we know she's a witch. And if she drowns, oops, I guess we were wrong. That's a parasitic idea. Mm-hmm. So there are many reasons for that. One of which is, as I said earlier, it helps us get through difficulties in life. For example, some people argue that religion itself, Daniel Dennett, the famous evolutionary philosopher, argued that religion is akin to a parasite. So there are a wide variety of reasons why we are susceptible to this parasitic thinking.
I'll get on to religion a little bit later, because
Sure.
it's something you touch on quite a bit. But I'm guessing from what you say, even a good leader or someone who's a great orator essentially is infecting everyone.
Well, I mean, that's Machiavelli, right? Machiavelli said it doesn't matter if the leader is truly an honest person. What matters is that you manage that's why when you say, for example, someone has Machiavellian intelligence, a salesperson who has high Machiavellian intelligence, what is he or she doing? They are tailoring their sales pitch as a function of the customer that they're standing next to, right? That's what a politician does. That's why when politicians are on the campaign, you always see them with a baby. Why? Because that shows that I am nurturing, I am kind, I am compassionate, right? You never see them with babies unless it's about 7 days before the election cycle. So of course, it's all about this kind of impression management.
And I guess dating sites, the person always has a puppy.
A puppy, or I've actually joked once, but it's based on actual science. If you hold a puppy, if you hold a guitar, and you come out of a Porsche wearing a fireman uniform, sit back and enjoy the ladies.
Fair enough. You've alluded to, the issues that you are concerned with in the parasitic mind. What do you think are the three biggest risks facing us because of the parasitic mind?
And so the answer to that is also picked up in my forthcoming book called Suicidal Empathy,
We'll touch on that.
touch on that. Look, it causes us to take certain public policy decisions that are deeply problematic. On a smaller scale, although an important one, it causes about 900 medals to be given. This was an actual study that, commissioned by the United Nations, because people say, well, what's the big deal about this transgender thing? Well, there've been almost, and that's an underestimate, 900 medals in major competitions that have been given to biological males, and hence real biological women have lost those places on the podium. So in a small scale, you get this kind of consequence. But how about unchecked illegal immigration? What does that do to the vitality of a society? I mean, economically, it certainly doesn't help. How about if it changes the fabric of that society? How about if you let in millions of people who don't share your foundational values, you're going to irrevocably change the nature of that society. So there are a wide range of consequences, most of them negative, that come about if we allow these parasitic ideas to flourish. By the way, the perfect manifestation of someone who is both a manifestation of a parasitized mind and suicidally empathetic is our current Prime Minister.
Oh, we're here in Canada.
In Canada,
okay,
yes,
right.
sir.
Well, we can touch on the politics in a moment. But the reason I'm asking it in this way is that you talk about, say, immigration, for example.
Sure.
It sounds like it's a broad, sweeping brush when you apply the idea to immigration. People forget the nuances, and that is that there are benefits from immigration. I mean,
of course.
In the US, they're going crazy in the agricultural sector now because they've lost all the workers. So how do you balance not overgeneralizing in such a way that it's counterproductive?
Right. It just has to be common sense, right? I'm an immigrant, so oftentimes people will write to me and say, you're such a hypocrite. You rail against open-door immigration, but you're an immigrant yourself, and your buddy Elon Musk is an immigrant, so why are you railing against immigration? That's like arguing that my little cat, house cat Fido, is a feline, and the lion in the jungle is a feline. Therefore, since they're both feline, you should also go to the jungle and cuddle up with the lion in the jungle. Immigration has to be pursued in such a way that it always leads to a net benefit to the host society. If that criterion is met, then come in, my brother, and let's build a more pluralistic society together. If you allow entry to millions of people who are coming in for no other reason than you being empathetic, it's not going to result in good outcomes.
One of the things you wrote in The Parasitic Mind, to quote you, is that progressivism has become the enemy of reason. And you talk about, I love this term, the land of progressive unicornia, referring to unicorns, a mythical but admired creature. Why do you feel that progressivism is the enemy as such? Isn't there room for some understanding?
Because it is always rooted in this hopeful ethos. So take, for example, social constructivism, which basically says we're born tabula rasa with equal potentiality. And the only reason that Lionel Messi became Lionel Messi or Albert Einstein became Albert Einstein is because of a particular schedule of reinforcement, some socialization. Maybe his parents hugged him a lot, or maybe they didn't hug him enough, or maybe they took him to McDonald's enough, or maybe not enough. It can't be because there is innate differences in potentiality across people. Because here what the progressives are mixing up is equality under the law with equal potentiality. Now, it's very hopeful for me to think that all of my children have the potential to become the next Lionel Messi if only I find the right schedule of hugging. But the reality is my children are unlikely to become NBA players because I'm a short Jewish guy. Okay, the genes are already working again. Now, there are some short guys that ended up in the NBA, but the statistics are against you. So me recognizing that there are certain biological realities is harder to swallow than the progressive unicornia that says, given the right schedule, we will all be beautiful. Socialism is a wonderful idea if you're 3 years old, because I teach my kindergarten kid that sharing is caring. It's inherently unfair that Elon Musk has more money than the guy who's homeless, right? Wouldn't it be better if benevolent government comes in and it creates equality? That's what Kamala Harris told us. Well, socialism and communism have been tried in endless countries. They've always failed. Why? Because unicornia is inconsistent with human nature. I'll tell you a quick quote that I think you'll love. E.O. Wilson, are you familiar with E.O. Wilson?
I don't recognize the name.
E.O. Wilson was a Harvard biologist who recently passed away, one of the great scientists of the 20th century. His specialty was social ants. He was an entomologist who studied social ants. Now, in social ant colonies, it actually is communistic. There is a reproductive queen, and then there's a bunch of worker ants and a bunch of warrior ants that are completely indistinguishable from each other. So when he was asked in an interview, Professor Wilson, what are your thoughts on communism? His answer was, great idea, wrong species, right? So what the progressives are doing, they're saying, we will impose our beautiful, rosy view of unicornia to a species that hasn't evolved to be consistent with that unicornia. So no, I think it's a bad idea to succumb to these ideas.
So essentially, it sounds like you're saying the land of progressive unicornia ignores basic science.
Exactly. It ignores the most fundamental features of our evolved human nature. Here's a great example from, so I teach at a business school. So many years ago, there was a company that decided that they wanted to break free of the antiquated notions of toxic masculinity. In what context? Romance novels are almost exclusively read by women around the world, right? Literally almost exclusively. And I'm about to describe to you the exact same male protagonist that's been depicted in every romance novel ever written. You ready? He's a count. He's got some royal title. He's a neurosurgeon. He's tall. He's bold. He's aggressive. He wrestles alligators on a ab pack, but he could only be tamed by the love of this one woman. I just gave you the plagiarized version of every single romance novel that has ever existed. Why is that? Because women fantasize about a particular type of male archetype. It's part of their innate human nature. Now, this progressive unicornia company came along and said, we want to break free of this toxic masculinity. So they're going to come up with a guy that cries a lot, sucks his thumbs, goes in a fetal position, is pear-shaped, has a whiny voice, he's very sweet and sensitive. Guess what happened to that line? The market said, I don't want it. So you thought that you had the chutzpah to impose what you want consumers to read, and consumers said, no, no, no. I come with an endowed human nature, and I decide what I want to fantasize about. So there are real consequences to approaching political systems or consumer products with a lack of an understanding of human nature.
You reserve quite a lot of ire in your book for what you call the SJW, social justice warriors. Explain that concept.
So the social justice warrior is typically someone who is very much entrenched in sort of progressive unicornia. I even give an example of a type of social justice warrior with a spicy term. Do you know where I'm going with this? Male feminist as sneaky. Do you remember what the last part is? Sneaky effers. Sneaky.
Okay.
Okay. Now, that term, sneaky effer, actually comes from science. So in the 1970s, the official scientific term is kleptogamy, which is the stealing of mating opportunities. But the colloquial term, even within the scientific literature, is a sneaky effer. So example, you have many species where the males, there are two phenotypes of male. There's the traditional male who is, very masculine and so on. There is another type of phenotype of a male that mimics females. So when the big dominant male sees this one, it dupes him into thinking that he is a female and then goes around and surreptitiously engages in mating opportunities. So I took this principle from the animal kingdom and I argued that human male feminists, social justice warriors, are adopting the sneaky effort strategy.
I remember this now, yeah.
I'm very, very kind. I hug the trees. When I put gas into my car, I start crying because I am raping Mother Earth with the devil's juice and so on. And so I'm very kind. You could trust me, Linda. You don't have to worry about me. I'm a kind and compassionate person. I'm a sneaky effort.
How do you propose to protect those who are genuinely vulnerable? Because we can't all be that archetypal, super strong alligator wrestling type. There are those who need, to some degree, I guess, support and protection. So how does it not kind of dissolve into this, as you say, unicornia kind of perspective?
Look, I'm not suggesting that empathy is something that should be eradicated. We are a multifaceted creature, right? We can be ruthlessly violent and we can be infinitely kind and loving, right? She's not on camera right here, but my daughter is here. I would be willing to jump in front of a truck to save her life, right? So that allows me to have empathy, have love, have unlimited compassion for the right targets, right? But on the other, the problem is when you take these virtues and they misfire. So I don't know if we want to talk about suicidal empathy later, but maybe
we'll talk about it after. But carry on.
Yeah.
Carry on.
So suicidal empathy is simply the misfiring of an otherwise adaptive emotion. So let me draw an analogy. OCD is a psychiatric disorder, right? But at its root, it is based on something that is quite evolutionarily advantageous. The idea of scanning the environment for potential threats makes perfect evolutionary sense. But for most of us, once we have tended to that threat, it then goes away. So for example, if you and I shake hands and I notice that a minute before you shook my hand, you sneezed into your hand, I might later quietly go into the bathroom and wash my hands. I wash my hands once and then I resume our interaction. the OCD sufferer will be stuck in an infinite loop for the next 8 hours, washing their hands until their skin is falling off in scalding hot water. So it is a misfiring of an otherwise adaptive process. So yes, be empathetic, be kind, be generous, be compassionate. Those are all part of the repertoire of human realities, but it has to be properly regulated.
What you refer to, though, in the parasitic mind is something that's very interesting, and I think a lot of people recognize this based on what we see in the media, and that is the faux outrage, false outrage.
Exactly. So, and here I can link it, if you like, very quickly to an evolutionary principle. So for a signal to be meaningful, it has to be costly. And let me explain what I mean by that. You take a peacock's tail, right? The peacock's tail could not have evolved via natural selection. Natural selection is the mechanism that confers survival advantage for that trait to have evolved. Well, when the peacock evolves that big tail, it is burdensome, it makes it more conspicuous to predators, it makes it more difficult to take flight. So why would evolution have resulted in the evolution of such a burdensome tail? Well, there we talk about sexual selection. Some traits evolve because they confer a reproductive advantage. So even though it is handicapping me from a survival perspective, I am communicating to the peahens, the females of that species, despite the fact that I've got this very burdensome tail, I am still here. Shouldn't you choose me as your mate? How am I going to link this to what you just asked? Putting hashtag bring the girls home, putting hashtag refugees welcome, love is love, and all the other nonsense is costless. So it's not an honest signal. It's a faux signal. Any of us can meet it. But if I speak openly in some regions of the Middle East where I know I might be taken into the back corner and a bullet is put through my head, that is a costly signal. That is true signaling and not virtue signaling.
I remember the section where you were saying basically choose me when it came to peacocks and peahens. But it made me also wonder, you use this term, it's just an aside that just occurred to me, this term testicular fortitude quite a bit in the book. And that made me think, well, what about the women?
Yes. Well, here I use it in a sort of hyperbolic sense. Right. Margaret Thatcher has more testicular fortitude than most men alive today in the West. Right. So it applies equally to both sexes. Or if I were a transgender activist, to the 680 different genders.
When it comes to making decisions, I know you say there's a danger in prioritizing feelings over facts.
Yes, sir.
But isn't part of the problem that people don't really know what the facts are anymore, that, you know, they're so busy looking for confirmation bias?
Yeah, that's true. Let me discuss first the tension between feelings and thought.
Please.
It's a false dichotomy. It's not that we are an animal of reason rather than an animal of feeling. We are both, right? The challenge is to know when to invoke the right system at the right time. So if I'm walking down in a dark alley because I'm taking a shortcut to get home, and then I notice 4 young men who are loitering, I will get a fear-based response. My heart will start racing. I will start breathing heavier, my blood pressure will go up. All of these things have triggered my emotional-based system, and it makes perfect evolutionary sense for that to have happened. On the other hand, if I'm trying to do well on a calculus exam, triggering my emotional system is not going to make me do a better job on the calculus exam. Now, I apply that example when it comes to, say, choosing our political leaders. Regrettably, most people end up invoking their affective system rather than their cognitive system. And so here I talk about, actually an expression from Arabic says that getting drunk by simply smelling the cork of the wine bottle. Right. Because what that basically says, I don't need to actually drink the wine to get drunk. I just take a whiff and I'm already, right? So it refers to someone who has a weak cognitive constituency, right? So for example, if you ask people, why do you love Obama? Well, he's tall, he's lanky, he's got a mellifluous voice, he's got a radiant smile. It could well be that every single syllable he utters is complete rubbish, but I'm already getting drunk by his cork. On the other hand, why do you hate Donald Trump? Well, he's cantankerous, he speaks like a brawler from New York, he's not presidential, but you didn't say anything about whether you agree with his immigration policy or his fiscal policy. So the reason why I discussed that tension is because many of the problems that we face is because we trigger the wrong system at the wrong time. Regarding your issue of what do we know what is true or not, well, one thing I could tell you is that there shouldn't be a government agency that decides for us what is true or not. I don't know if you remember under the Biden administration, there was a woman, Nina something, that came out who was going to be the first official czar of disinformation. I mean, Orwell couldn't have come up with such a ridiculous notion. Do you remember her?
Vaguely, but I was thinking the issue is partly that with politics, the scene has become distorted anyway.
Right. Well, and look, for example, in science, once you utter the words, these two words, settled science, you understand nothing about science. Because science deals in provisional truths. Yes, right. There is a truth, but that truth can move. What we thought was true, I mean, the Copernican revolution was about people thinking one way about the cosmos, and then Copernicus and Galileo came along and said, no, that's not how it works. So the idea that it's settled science, and therefore we need to remove your YouTube channel, we need to get you off of Twitter because you are espousing false beliefs. Is it disinformation to say that men menstruate, or is it veridical information? So this whole idea of we tell you what the facts are is a terribly Orwellian, dangerous idea.
I'll get on to how this has been affected by social media and the mainstream media as we progress. But what I was getting at also is, isn't it now that in the case with politics, it is more about smelling the cork than actually listening to what the real policy should be?
And I think there is a reason for that. Look, we face a lot of computational complexity in our everyday life, right? Imagine if I sat there aching about every single decision by looking at every single piece of information that is relevant before I decide which restaurant to go to or which car to purchase. Then I would be stuck in choice paralysis, right? So I use what are called decision rules or heuristics that allows me to cut through the clutter, right? And so, for example, when people evoke their affective system, that's a very quick shortcut, right? Because it allows me to say, look, how do I feel about Obama? He's lovely and majestic. How do I feel about Trump? He seems mean and cantankerous. Good enough, right? Because it cuts through the clutter. Now, it's a suboptimal way of making decisions, but it is a very quick way to navigate through the computational complexity.
You know, when it comes to it, in your opinion, which is more important, truth or freedom? And who wins when they clash? For example, if you have people, putting out, because of free speech, putting out falsehoods, disinformation, and so on in the media?
It's very hard to put a ordinal ranking on which one requires the other in an infinite loop, right? I can't pursue truth if I don't have the freedom to pursue truth, and vice versa, right? So that's what and I'm glad you raised those two, because I'm guessing you're referring to the parasitic mind, where in chapter 1, I say that the two fundamental ideals that that inform my life are truth and freedom, right? I don't think you can have one without the other, right? I have to have the complete freedom to be able to pursue truth where it takes me, which, by the way, leads to a very dangerous idea, forbidden knowledge, which I briefly referred to in the parasitic mind, and I pick up again in suicidal empathy. Forbidden knowledge is the idea that there are some inquiries that we should refrain from pursuing because the consequences would be too great to pursue them, right? Now, and if I may, let me explain here the concept of deontological versus consequentialist ethics. Deontological ethics is absolute statements. It is never okay to lie would be a deontological statement. A consequentialist statement would be, it's okay to lie if you're trying to spare someone's feelings. And so I often joke that if you want to have a long, happy marriage,
I remember, yeah.
Right? And your spouse says, do I look fat in those jeans? Put on your consequentialist hat and say, you've never looked more beautiful. You're lying, perhaps, but that is a consequentialist lie. For most things in life, it is perfectly reasonable for us to be consequentialists. For freedom of speech, for the pursuit of truth, for journalistic integrity, those are by definition deontological statements. So if you say, yes, pursue truth, but don't hurt people's feelings, the but there is a big problem.
Professor, from where do you get your news? How do you make sure you're getting what you would consider accurate?
Wow, what a great question. It's really a collection of stuff. Some of it TV, some of it I read, some of it is just the scrolling through X. So I don't have a single one-stop shop place. It's a bit of the, but what I try to do is triangulation of the veracity of information. Do you see what I mean by that?
Yeah. I always say that there's a triangle: information plus diversity leads to perspective.
Right. So, there you go.
But the thing is, are you constantly aware of the risk of an echo chamber? Constantly trying to validate your own thoughts, because you're obviously quite forceful in your thoughts. There's a risk you could always be seeking validation.
Albeit, if you, for example, will look at some of my now I have a lot of followers, so I can't give you an empirical estimate, but I can oftentimes have on my feed 2 people that just responded to something that I posted, and they couldn't be more diametrically opposed from each other. Now, I actually take that with some encouragement, meaning that if every time I post something, everybody always agreed with me, then probably I've created an echo chamber. But if, just with one post, I can have 20 people, 14 of whom agreed with me, 6 who haven't, then I think I'm building a diversified chamber.
So I used to give this example that if I covered the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and I would have people from both sides, but either way, no matter how I did the debate or the conversation, I would get viewer feedback saying, "Oh, you're so pro-Palestinian," for the same show where they said, "You're so pro-Israeli." And my producer would say, "How can that be?" I said, "Well, my explanation was people bring their own baggage
exactly
when they're watching, and that's why I ask in your case how you kind of put your mind outside that potential echo chamber."
Well, so I'll give you an example of confirmation bias that my former doctoral supervisor had told me many years ago. So he had been hired to help some company. He's a cognitive psychologist and consumer specialist at Cornell. He just recently retired, by the way. So he had been hired by a company where half the executives seemed to be for a product launch and the other half seemed to be deadly set against the product launch. And so what was going to break the tie is they were going to bring a bunch of them, put them in a focus group, and then based on that interaction, either one side would win or one side or the other side would win. After that interaction happened, then you polled both sides. Both sides said, "You see, we won." Now, how could it be? How could it be that they both saw the exact same interaction and arrived at exactly the opposite confirmation, right? Well, it's exactly to your point, which is I only look for information that supports my position, and I filter out perceptually and cognitively any information that doesn't agree with my position, and therefore I solidify my anchored position. I was recently asked on a show by a British psychiatrist, this was about a year ago, at the end of the show, maybe the best question I've ever been asked, maybe you'll beat it on this show. He said, what is the singular phenomenon that, you've seen in the human condition in your 30 plus years as a professor that has most surprised you? So I had to pause for a second. And then I said, the inability for most people to change their anchored positions, irrespective of the amount of conflicting evidence that they might be shown. Which itself, and that's why, by the way, in chapter 7 of The Parasitic Mind, I try to offer a means by which we can break through that resistance. I talk about nomological networks of cumulative evidence, which we could talk about. So I'm mindful of even my capacity to succumb to this kind of echo chamber. That's why I try to sample from many different sources.
How do you regard conspiracy theories? The moon landing wasn't real, or that there were chips in vaccines during COVID, these kind of things that are out there. How do you regard them?
I apply the scientific method, right? So I think there is now enough evidence that the Holocaust did happen. So if you're a Holocaust denier who argues that, it was all Hollywood made and there were no ovens and so on, I don't have to take it seriously because I know the accumulation of evidence has already established that thing happened. And so you just apply the scientific method as you navigate between what is true or false. There's no other way to do it.
It's difficult, though, with things like the moon landing. It doesn't have the same empirical basis as the Holocaust, for example.
That is true. That is true. But by the way, I don't know if it's the right time to do it, but maybe it is. Do you want me to talk about how you do the nomological networks?
Please do, yeah.
So in a sense, it speaks to your general question. How do you seek truth? How do you know what's true, what's not true? And so in chapter 7, the chapter's titled How to Seek Truth, I argue that there is an incredibly powerful, albeit very cognitively taxing method to try to decide whether something is true or not. So let's take, for example, I give several examples in the chapter, but I'll discuss one here. Let's suppose I wanted to counter the idea that social constructivists offer that toy preferences are sex-specific due to socialization, meaning it's because mommy taught Linda to play with the doll and taught Bobby to play with the truck. That's why they have those preferences. Let's suppose I wanted to demonstrate to you that that's not true. There are universal biological and evolutionary-based reasons for those sex-specific toy preferences. How would I go about doing that? So I'm going to build a nomological network of cumulative evidence, meaning I'm going to get you data from across cultures, across time periods, across species, across methodologies that will triangulate to demonstrate that this position is unassailable. So, and I'll give a few examples. Well, from developmental psychology, we know that young infants who are too young to yet be socialized, by definition, they don't have the cognitive apparatus to be socialized, already exhibit those sex-specific toy preferences. So that already takes out the socialization argument. I can get you data from vervet monkeys, rhesus monkeys, and chimpanzees showing that they have the same sex-specific toy preferences. I can get you data from sub-Saharan Africa where cultures that are very non-Western, they exhibit the same sex-specific toy preferences. I could go back 2,500 years ago showing you that in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, on funerary monuments, little boys and girls are depicted playing with exactly the same types of toys as we have today. So look how I am putting the epistemological noose around your neck. I don't have to emote louder than you. I don't have to scream louder than you. If I can have this, gargantuan triangulation of evidence, I'll let that do the talking for me. And so that's why, by the way, I'm epistemologically quite humble in that I know what I know, and I know what I don't know. That's why I never get caught in interviews. I give thousands of interviews because I'll never try to wing it. If you ask me a question that I think that I haven't done the requisite nomological network for, I'll say, hey, Riz, that's a great question. It's above my pay grade. I don't know. Right. But if I know, good luck to you if you want to debate me.
Fair enough. No, because a lot of people obviously want to try to catch you out. Yeah. But if you know your stuff, that's obviously going to be important. But it was interesting because you did say people who spew falsehoods should be judged. Now that stuck with me with Paris.
Judged that doesn't mean imprisoned.
No, I didn't. I realized what you meant. It was the whole chapter on us taking a position and so on, which is why I started asking you about my situation as a journalist. Because of course, as a human being, I have in my head judgments and opinions, but I really, difficult as it is, I enforce them in terms of my journalistic work. I want to stand away and hear the story. So many people say that politicians in general happily lie. And in the case of Donald Trump, who I know you do like as a politician, he regularly is accused of lying, and people actually metrically record this. How do you reconcile your belief then about his veracity with that documentation?
So there are lies and then there are lies. So Donald Trump lies about, I've got the biggest in the world. I'm the greatest lover in the history of humanity. The biggest audience was ever at my inauguration, right? They're ego defensive lies, right? So is he fibbing? Undoubtedly. That is a very different lie than if you are a postmodernist saying that there are no objective truths. That eradicates the possibility of truth being. And it's that allows them to say slavery is freedom, war is peace, men are women. So lies don't all come in the same final shape, right? Is he lying in the sense that he's constantly trying to protect his ego because he's a benign narcissist? Yes. But there are guys on the progressive side that are lying. If you say, for example, that socialism is the means by which people are most likely to flourish, that is a much more consequential lie than I am the best lover of all time. Both are lies. One is much bigger than the other.
But he does have those consequential ones too. They're eating the cats and dogs in Springfield, Illinois, and so on. People react to this.
Yeah, okay. In that case, I think it's the fog of the rapidity of how information comes about, right? I think, though, and Elon Musk recently said it, he said, look, we will put out stuff often and it'll turn out to be false, in which case we're happy to correct our position. So just have the epistemological humility to accept that sometimes you'll get it wrong.
True. No, I heard him say that. He was actually in the White House as he said it.
Exactly.
Now, the question is this, though. If putting out this information without checking its veracity in the first place, there are consequences, the risks are great. That's
Right.
So. From your side, how do you rationalize that with saying someone like this is worth the leadership position?
Because I think all politicians lie, as you said. The question is which one is the lesser of a liar. I don't think that when I put my imprimatur in supporting a particular candidate, I think that they are interchangeable with a saint, right? I think that given these options, this is probably the better option. So given the types of values that are important to me, it is incontestable to me that Donald Trump would have been a much better choice than Kamala Harris.
All right, you're picking between those candidates, but I'm talking in a general sense with politicians.
They all lie.
I was going to say, so in the sense of Donald Trump, you see him as something of a cure. As you said in a recent essay, you wrote about his election victory saying, it's an unequivocal repudiation of the ideological parasites that have wreaked havoc on our societies.
Yes.
And if, as you also say, it took decades of assiduous indoctrination for these parasitic ideas to flourish in every nook and cranny of our institutions, we'll get onto those further.
Yeah.
How can 4 years of a Trump presidency turn them around? You've said it, it takes decades.
That's a fantastic question. It's actually one that I keep hammering now with people, that don't be complacent in thinking that just because Donald Trump, he came along, he's got the polio vaccine, he administers it everywhere, and polio ceases to exist. To your point, what you just mentioned, it took, depending on the parasitic idea, it's taken between 50 to 100 years for these idea pathogens to develop originally on university campuses and then to break out of the university. So it won't be sufficient to only kind of rest on our laurels to say, hey, Donald Trump is here, we've eradicated this nonsense. That's why even I've had people who say to me, so now that Donald Trump has come to power, will people even read Suicidal Empathy? I say, of course they will, because these parasitic ideas have not gone away. The reflex to be suicidally empathetic is not going to magically go away because this guy came into office for 4 years. The next president might be one that is as committed to these parasitic ideas, and off we go on the woke train. So there's much more in the fight to be had.
I want to get your perspective on this as someone who's actually a couple of years younger than me, but around the same kind of age. For me, it seemed like there was a massive change in the curve where this suddenly all became public. I don't remember these kind of debates for the last, say, 40, 45 years.
Because you weren't in academia. So it takes a while for all of these. So, for example, take shingles. The virus is within you, it's dormant, and then something will trigger it such that you might get an outbreak and I don't. But it is in there. So what you were reacting to is the fact that you didn't know that shingles was, flourishing in the background, whereas I was living in the petri dish of shingles called academia. So, and let me give you the background of how I first was exposed to, Houston, we have a problem. So my scientific work originally was in the application of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology and studying human behavior in general and consumer behavior and economic behavior in particular. And so as I tried to Darwinize the business school, the idea being that you can't study entrepreneurship or leadership or consumer behavior or economic behavior without ever invoking our biological nature. To me, that seemed like a very banal and obvious statement. Well, apparently it was completely heretical to most of my academic colleagues. And so I was right, that was my first exposure to parasitic ideas. How could these otherwise bright, educated people be questioning the fact that human beings, consumers are biological? You don't think our hormones affect our behavior? How? Right? And so I saw it, but it took a while for other people who were not inhabiting that ecosystem to then hit them. And that to me is frustrating, because had people listened when I stood up on top of the mountain and saying we have a problem, then we wouldn't have had to have 900 medals being stolen by trans women. You see what I mean?
I hear you. Yeah.
I appeared in 2017. I appeared in front of the Canadian Senate. I was summoned, as was Jordan Peterson, separately, to talk about Bill C-16, which at the time was a bill that hadn't passed yet, trying to incorporate gender identity and gender expression under the hateful rubric umbrella. And I said, yeah, of course, I support the idea that no person should face any bigotry, but beware of the proverbial slippery slope. Now, if you go back and you listen to my warnings, I hate to say it, but they were prophetic.
How do you regard the way, well, this also occurred to me, the word political correctness came in, I don't know what, maybe 15, 20 years ago that I could really remember. And suddenly all the parameters changed. I couldn't put on an African accent, for example. I certainly couldn't, if I was an actor, go on, blacken my face and appear as an African. When that all started to emerge, how did you regard that?
I was very concerned by it because I saw the kind of stifling environment it created in otherwise banal interactions on campuses. So people were, I remember at one point someone asked me, this was probably about 10 years ago, oh, where are you from originally? And I was about to answer. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I know that I'm not supposed to ask that. I said, what do you mean you're not supposed to ask that? You recognize that I don't look as though I'm indigenous to Canada because I have a particular morphological look. What's the problem with you asking where I come from originally? So I've noticed that for a while. I compare it, and you might remember this from the parasitic mind. The parasitic wasp stings a much bigger spider, rendering it zombified, and then it takes it to its burrow, lays its eggs on it, and then its eggs, as they hatch, eat the spider in vivo while it's alive. And so I argue that political correctness is akin to the spider wasp sting because it stultifies me, right? I'm now afraid to say, I recognize that you don't look French Canadian. So what if I were to say, Mr. Khan, where are you from? How is that an insult? But that's what happens with political correctness. It removes our ability to have natural dynamics.
Just an aside, I tend to say, what are your roots?
What are your roots?
I find it kind of safer. And this is the issue. Aren't there so many landmines now onto which we can easily step?
Not if you're called Gad Saad. I mean, I don't give a shit. You know, there's a, and I invoke this in chapter 8 of the Parasitic Mind. I say, activate your inner honey badger. Right? The honey badger, for the viewers and listeners who may not know, has been literally ranked as the most ferocious and fierce animal in the animal kingdom, which is saying a lot. There are a lot of ferocious animals in the animal kingdom. The reason, it's the size of a small dog. It is so fierce that adult lions will stay clear of it, right? That's why there's the expression, honey badgers don't give an F. I live my life this way, maybe to a fault, and I wish more people would invoke.
You end the book basically saying evoke your honey badger. You know.
Exactly.
How do you regard Andrew Tate? I interviewed him at his home in Romania.
Yeah, I've never interacted with him. I don't know much about him. I mean, he seems maybe not to my aesthetic taste in terms of his delivery, like kind of the bro stuff. Some of his, and I'm hardly one who can't engage in locker room talk, right? I mean, I was literally a soccer player myself. So it's not as though I'm a dainty Puritan madam. But he seems a bit too harsh for me.
He's had a lot of influence, especially on young men.
On young men, yes.
You know, in the approach to some of the things you talk about, you can't refute facts like, you know, men are physiologically stronger than women and so on. I think that's why I was curious in case you'd come across.
I mean, he certainly will say some things that are backed by evolutionary science, if not common sense. But I think the style of how he does it is a bit problematic. What did you think of him? Did you enjoy interacting with him?
Yeah, it was actually interesting talking with him because, again, I think he's used to people engaging him for an argument.
Yes.
And he had to stop and think when I just asked an innocent question.
Right.
So, you know, I'm going to go back to Donald Trump just for a couple more questions. Joe Rogan, someone with whom you've appeared a number of times now, has been very influential. How much do you think he played a role in tipping the scale in favor of Donald Trump? Huge.
As a matter of fact, before he had appeared with Joe Rogan, I was in touch with Trump's people about him coming on my show, which is a much smaller show than, I mean, I'm a popular guy, but I'm not Joe Rogan popular. And when they had asked me, what would be your idea of, you know, what would you want to get out of it? I said, well, you know what I'd love? Just to sit with him and to humanize him so that the people who are on the fence can actually see he's a funny guy. He's got a great sense of humor. He's a regular. He could, you know, just shoot the blank, right? Well, that's exactly what ended up happening when he went for 3 hours on Joe Rogan, which, of course, at that point, once he's done Joe Rogan, there's no point on coming on my show. He's done the biggest show. But So to your question, I think it really helped to humanize him, because so often his interactions are ones where he's put on the back foot, where he's defensive, whereas here he's calm, he's relaxed, there's no gotcha stuff. With just two guys chatting, I think it probably flipped a few people who were fence sitting.
How do you feel he's done so far now, about a month into the presidency as we're talking?
I don't think, I mean, as you said, I'm a bit younger than you. I can't think of a 4-week period where a president did more stuff than this guy has done.
Is it good stuff?
Well, you tell me, is there some bad stuff? Is there some stuff?
Well, I'm asking you really, because I'm essentially just taking the position of getting your perspective on this.
Yeah, so far, I haven't seen anything that has caused me great alarm. He got rid of all the Title IX stuff where biological males can enter female spaces. That's good. He's trying to cut down on, open border immigration. I think that's good. He's trying to reduce the excessive waste and corruption through Doge. That's good. So far, I think I'm happy.
Okay, because some would say there's been some backfiring. Firing all those people, in the government who now suddenly have to be re-recruited because it's overdone. The Gaza Riviera,
Yeah, that's a bit of Trump bombast. I'm not sure if I would have approached it exactly the same way. But that, again, is, I think, stylistic, right? He's a great negotiator. It could well be that he says that without literally meaning that, because he's trying to angle for a better negotiation position. So I can't pretend to know what's exactly in his mind, but I can see how the optics of such a proposal could irk a lot of people the wrong way.
Now, in the parasitic mind, you talked about an analogy where there's an elderly woman being attacked in an alleyway.
Yes.
And you could be one of two sorts of people. The one who goes in and helps, or the one who kind of walks away and avoids getting involved. And you said, be the first. You can get involved. Some might say with what's just happened, as we're talking again, with the situation with Ukraine, he has now said, I'll go into Ukraine, but if we can have mineral rights. It's like, I'll help you, old lady, but as long as you give me some money from your purse.
Except, hasn't there been already a lot of the purse of the United States taxpayer given to Ukraine? So the question becomes, how far do you want to take this? I mean, how much are the American and frankly the Canadian taxpayers owing in the protection of Ukraine? If you are a strong isolationist, you'd say we've already spent way too much money. If you're a globalist, we haven't spent enough money. It depends on your perspective.
Talking of those close to the president, Elon Musk is also a fan of yours and your book.
Yes.
And he's certainly, a lot of his decisions. I wonder, do you feel that he was shaped to some degree by what you wrote in The Parasitic Mind?
Well, there is an article that came out in Wall Street Journal about 7-8 months ago. The title of the article, "The Man Who Fuels Elon Musk's Nightmares." Do you know who that man is? So I suspect, it's hard to answer that question without being immodest, but certainly I probably played a hand.
I have to look for that. I missed that in my research. But you said that Elon Musk should get the Nobel Prize.
I do.
In which field?
We probably peace, in the sense that someone will probably correct me, but I would say probably within a week of him having purchased Twitter, I did a sad truth clip where I said, of all the things that Elon Musk has done and anything that he will do in the future, none will be as historically consequential as him having bought X.
No, I remember you'd quoted that.
Exactly. And so the fact that he has freed many of us from the oversight of in French you say les bien-pensants, the good thinkers, the ones who are better, or as Thomas Sowell would say, the anointed ones. The fact that I can now go on a thing and even use the R word. You know what the R word is? Somebody says something really idiotic. I go, come on, man, are you retarded?
Right, yeah.
So that was completely a no-no. The only strike I ever got on former Twitter, I think it was maybe like a 7-day violation, was because I had used the R word. Real life cannot be sanitized in this way, right? When I was in the Lebanese civil war, I didn't know if the next minute I was going to live or not. And that was my reality growing up. You can handle the R word.
How did you find Elon Musk as a person?
So we spent a lot of time together. He actually had invited me down to meet him at his house. We ended up spending maybe about 4 hours together. I found him to be incredibly engaging, very, very humble. I mean, we had communicated many times, but that was the first time that we had seen each other in person. Zero ego, just two guys. We literally hugged, sat there for 4 hours, completely locked in, sometimes discussing some very personal and intimate things, sometimes discussing about maintaining human consciousness via interplanetary travel. So sometimes it got very, esoteric and philosophical. Other times, as a matter of, now I could say it because he's mentioned it himself. He told me that the original, trigger for him that got him into the woke mind virus was the reality that he faced with his own son, who became his daughter, right? At the time, I didn't know if that was public, so I never had mentioned it. But, he was confiding in me in a very trusting way, in a very intimate way. So I thought he was just absolutely lovely. I mean, he is an eccentric guy, but I've got nothing but positive affection for him.
He got some flack for doing the Roman salute, which is often compared with the Nazi salute.
This thing, yes.
As someone who's culturally Jewish, how did you feel about that?
Well, I said, I actually had right away tweeted, I don't know if you saw it, I said, I can't believe that I was able to spend all this time in the Grand Nazi's house, and as a Jew, I came out alive. Of course, I was mocking the idea that he is, pro-Nazi and so on. It's so silly, come on.
A lot of the stuff you write, actually, this was interesting to note, even in your book, that irony and satire gets lost on a lot of people.
Oh my God, it's unbelievable. Well, first, the power of irony and satire and sarcasm. So in the book, in The Parasitic Mind, I say that it is akin to the surgeon's scalpel cutting through warm butter, right? The reason why dictators go after the satirists first. They don't go after the guys with the big muscles. Those are easy to handle. But the guy who's got the sharp tongue, the guy who's got the sharp pen, hence the pen is mightier than the sword, that's the one that I'm scared of, because he's the one who could attack my ideology, my position, right? So he makes me scared. And so that's the reason why I use satire and sarcasm. But to your point, what amazes me is how often, usually it's somebody new who doesn't know my style, who I'll write something that is completely satirical, and then they will just start sending me endless hate mail, not realizing that I was being satirical.
Well, Dr. Gad Saad explaining how he believes the parasitic mind is shaping our world today. On the next episode of the conversation I had with him, I challenge his fears that Islam is a danger to the world.
Islam, though, is a set of ideas that are codified, and then we could say, does Islam promote greater personal liberties and freedoms? Yes or no. There is only these answers. It's either yes or it's no, right? I would venture that based on historical facts, it doesn't promote greater personal liberties and freedoms. And so I can't be Islamophobic in saying that. It's a nonsensical term. I am a Islamo-realist.
Plus, a look at how suicidal empathy, also the title of his next book, will drag down the world order if it's not fully resisted now. Join us for that. But in the meantime, don't forget to leave your thoughts and comments, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time. A big thank you from me and the team for watching. I'm Riz Khan. See you soon.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, after a weekend that saw European leaders rally around Ukraine at a London summit, the French President Emmanuel Macron proposes a one-month truce in Ukraine. The Kremlin accuses President Volodymyr Zelenskyy of not wanting peace following his heated encounter with President Donald Trump on Friday. And as Israel blocks the entry of all goods and supplies into Gaza, that's raising fears that the ceasefire, which came into effect on the 19th of January, could collapse altogether. Hello and welcome to the programme. The fallout from Friday's Oval Office meeting between the US President Donald Trump and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is still being felt, sending shockwaves all the way around Europe, in particular to Kyiv. Well, some Republicans have reacted to that meeting, suggesting that the Russian President Vladimir Putin could be trusted and that the two men, if it is President Zelenskyy, out of the two men, it is President Zelenskyy who poses the greater obstacle to peace. Well, today the Kremlin has said that the Oval Office clash showed that how difficult it will be to reach a settlement to the conflict and that Ukraine does not, in fact, want peace. Well, Russia says it will continue to negotiate with the United States on normalizing bilateral ties.
What happened at the White House on Friday certainly showed how difficult it will be to get a path of settlement on Ukraine. The Kyiv regime and Zelenskyy do not want peace. They want the war to continue. So in this situation, of course, only Washington's efforts and Moscow's willingness will clearly not be enough. In fact, the entire Russian side has once again shown that President Putin was right when he said that the Russian side was ready for negotiations. But these good intentions are bogged down by the unwillingness of the Kyiv regime to maintain this dynamic. This is what we fully saw in Washington.
Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov speaking there. Well, let's get more analysis. We can speak now to Stephen Vaughan, former US trade representative under President Trump, who joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Great to have you with us. How would you characterize what happened in the Oval Office on Friday?
Well, I think that you had a situation where President Trump and Vice President Vance were talking to President Zelenskyy about potentially doing a deal to stabilize the situation in Ukraine. And obviously they got into a dispute over whether or not that deal was going to be strong enough from Ukraine's perspective. And I think President Zelenskyy obviously became fairly heated in some of his comments. And I think most people believe that's probably not the best way to negotiate with President Trump.
Well, people around the world, including allies of President Trump, say they were horrified by what happened. I mean, couldn't that have been avoided? I mean, it doesn't send a great signal to the rest of the world, does it? That kind of public dust-up?
Well, I think everybody's they'll have to look at the facts, and everybody will kind of have to decide for themselves. I thought it was a pretty straightforward disagreement over whether or not the proposals that were being put on the table were going to be viable. But I think, part of what I think is people sit down and negotiate with the president, negotiate with the United States. You have to decide what's going to be the best way to achieve your goals. And I don't think that getting into a public dispute in the Oval Office is probably the best way to achieve anybody's goals.
I mean, I'm assuming that those events were watched with great glee in Moscow, and we've just had the Kremlin saying that the United States government now largely aligns with Moscow's vision. I mean, from the outside, looking at the narrative coming from the Kremlin these last couple of years and listening to some of the accusations that have been leveled now at the Ukrainian president, I mean, I'm not seeing a huge difference, in fact, between the two. Are you?
Well, I think I think that's a bit overblown. I mean, I think obviously there's a very big difference. The United States has consistently supported Ukraine for a very long time. President Trump, Secretary Bessent was on our television stations yesterday. They had a deal in terms of a future economic relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine. They were prepared to sign that deal, with President Zelenskyy. That's the reason he was there, was to do that. So I think that the notion that this is something that was designed to help Russia or is aligned with Russia or anything, I just think that's not really serious. I don't think anybody should take that very seriously.
Well, it's Russia that's saying this. The Kremlin again saying this shows, quote, Western unity is starting to fall apart. I mean, that sort of public dispute clearly not ideal from the point of view of showing solidarity to the rest of the world. But as you say, this natural resources deal is still unsigned. I mean, it is the only show in town, to quote the British ambassador to the United States, isn't it?
Well, I think that what President Trump has been saying is that basically the war needs to come to an end, and that he believes it should come to an end on, an honorable setting and honorable terms that are going to survive. And he believes he can negotiate an outcome that will lead to that. Now, if people think there are other options, then other people are obviously free to pursue other options. But I think in terms of the Americans and what they're likely to do, I think we've had a pretty long and robust debate over here about where we are. President Trump won the election. President Trump's going to get a chance to implement his policies.
Sure, but I mean, we've already had President Trump putting cards on the table, even ahead of the talks that took place between the Russians and the Americans a couple of weeks ago. And on the other side, there didn't seem to have been any concessions at all. And aren't Ukraine's allies collectively worried? I mean, after all, they've given, it would appear, according to some numbers, more than the United States has given in terms of assistance, military and otherwise. They don't want to see total capitulation here. I mean, aren't they justified in being worried?
I don't think the president was talking about total capitulation. I don't think anybody in the U.S. government is talking about total capitulation. I don't think anybody thinks that, the president is interested in total capitulation. I think what we're trying to do, or at least what the president is trying to do, is to come up with a deal that's going to be successful and is going to work. Now, if there are people who think that you can make a deal without making any concessions to the Russians or without doing anything to get Russia to come to the table, then people can try that. But it seems like that has been tried for several years. And I think President Trump is trying a different approach.
In terms of what happens next with regards to that deal, do you see it as a possibility that President Trump and President Zelenskyy meet again and actually get that deal signed and turn the page on that ugly scene on Friday? Or do you think other parties are going to have to step in as intermediaries?
I don't think if I were giving advice to anybody, I would not suggest that they use intermediaries in dealing with the White House. I mean, I think President Zelenskyy, would be well advised to reach out to the White House and have that conversation, and then he can decide, how he wants to do things. But I think, he and President Trump will manage that relationship as they see fit. But I certainly, I think the idea that they need some sort of an intermediary to go between them, I think that's misguided.
But isn't that because, I mean, wouldn't it be fair to have other parties involved, given that, Europe has given as much as the United States has in terms of aid?
I think there's two different issues. There's one question which says is that if Europe wants to be at the table and participate in negotiations, to be a part of that. But I think the notion that the Americans need Europe to help explain President Zelenskyy to them or them to President Zelenskyy, I don't think that's true. I think the United States is fully capable of conducting its own diplomacy.
So where do you see things heading to from here? What's your sort of prediction for the weeks ahead that President Zelenskyy comes back?
In the end, I think we're going to end up with something along the lines of what President Trump is talking about. I think realistically, the war needs to come to an end. I think the United States is very much committed to that. I think there are, any negotiation is tough. Any negotiation has its challenges. But I think that in the end, everyone is going to kind of realize that we're better off with a peaceful resolution, and there will be a peaceful resolution. There will be some things that the West would like to get that it probably won't get. There will certainly be things that Russia wanted to get that it won't get, but that's the nature of peace talks.
I mean, it's quite interesting hearing the difference in narrative, for example, from the United Kingdom, which played a pretty active role this weekend hosting that summit. I don't know if it was covered much in the United States, but there was a big summit in London, and President Zelenskyy was received by the King and everything else. And the British Armed Forces Minister said the war could stop tomorrow if President Putin stopped his illegal and unprovoked aggression. I mean, it seems like, on different sides of the Atlantic, there's quite a different vision as to how all of this started.
Well, I think everybody in America would be quite pleased if President Putin would stop his invasion and would back off. I don't think there's any question about that. I think the only difference between the Americans and some of the statements we hear out of Europe is the Americans, to me, seem to be a little bit more, willing to kind of recognize the facts on the ground. And we'll see. I believe over time, the UK and the EU and everybody are going to recognize the facts on the ground. That would be my expectation. I think President Trump has laid out kind of a path forward, and my guess is that's where the negotiations are going to go.
And do you agree with President Trump's approach here, which is to try to continue to ease relations with Moscow? Or would you urge him, or do you think people around him are urging him to be cautious in rushing into this?
Well, President Nixon dealt with Chairman Mao. President Roosevelt dealt with Premier Stalin. The Americans have had a lot of tough negotiations and tough relationships down through the years with a wide range of people. I think President Trump is recognizing that President Putin is a leader of a very important country and wants to make sure that he's thinking through the best ways to deal with that country. So I think that's kind of all that's happening here. I think that's very consistent with the traditions of U.S. diplomacy. During the Cold War, almost every U.S. president met with the leaders of the Soviet Union and had good relations with them and talked to them. And, obviously we had our disagreements and we had disputes, but we never let that prevent us, for the most part, from having diplomacy as well. So I don't see any reason why this is any different.
Okay, and just lastly, there are people in Europe who are scratching their heads after what's happened the last couple of weeks, and they're saying to themselves, is the United States still an ally? That is a question that is being asked on, certainly on British television channels. What's your answer to that question?
I think the United States has been a very friendly country to Western Europe for a long time. I expect it to remain a very friendly country to Western Europe for a long time. I think that what's happening is the Americans are taking a bit more of an approach that kind of is hoping to resolve some of these disputes and is hoping to put us in a situation where we can ultimately be stronger down the line. I think it's important to understand that what President Trump's trying to do here is ultimately put the U.S. in a stronger position, both economically and geopolitically. And I think he's going to get there, and I think he's going to achieve that. I'm old enough to remember when a lot of people in Western Europe were worried about President Reagan, and that all worked out well, and I think this will work out as well.
Okay. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Vaughan, former US Trade Representative.
Thank you very much.
President Trump. Thank you. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Matt Terrell, Managing Partner of Firehouse Strategies, who served as Chief of Staff for Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign. You join us, Matt, from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Just like to get your thoughts, first of all, as to what happened in the Oval Office on Friday. What's your overall assessment?
Sure. Well, look, I think the expectation among President Trump and his team was that President Zelenskyy would be coming to the White House to sign that deal. Obviously, that's not what occurred. I think that is not only the expectation of President Trump and his team, but it's what President Trump and his team wanted to see happen. I think President Trump feels as though that economic agreement, that economic deal would have been a good deal, not just for the United States, but a good deal for Ukraine, both in an economic sense, in terms of this minerals agreement, if you will, component of it. But also, I think President Trump and his team felt as though this agreement would have provided would be almost a security guarantee in its own right. It would have further intertwined the United States and Ukraine together. It present a greater partnership between the United States and Ukraine, thus serving as a greater deterrent to President Putin. At the end of the day, this agreement would have provided U.S. personnel, U.S. citizens, business people, other Americans would be on the ground in Ukraine. And I think President Trump and his team felt that in its own right would have served as a security agreement. And then beyond that, then of course, this would have had a great economic opportunity both for Ukraine and the United States as well. So at the end of the day here, obviously you saw a breakdown. This agreement did not get signed. And the real question is, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, you don't seem to have condemned in any way the decision by, the direction, let's say, that the conversation took and the mood in the Oval Office. We've heard from the former Polish president, Lech Walesa, who was, of course, a big figure in the post-communist era in Eastern Europe, who's written to President Trump. He's written this. Mr. President, we watched your conversation with the President of Ukraine with horror and distaste. We consider your expectations regarding showing respect and gratitude for the material assistance provided by the United States to Ukraine in its fight with Russia to be offensive. He goes on to say, gratitude is due to the heroic Ukrainian soldiers who shed blood in defense of the values of the free world. How would you respond to that?
Well, look, everyone's going to have their opinion on this, whether it's world leaders or members of Congress here in Washington, D.C. Everyone's got a right to have their opinion on what occurred. But I think where President Trump is coming from, if I'm just analyzing this holistically, I think where President Trump is at is certainly he had frustrations with President Zelenskyy in that meeting. Again, I think the administration felt in the lead up to this that multiple times, I think the administration, felt that President Zelenskyy had given them the belief that he'd be signing this agreement. It was President Zelensky's idea to come to Washington. It wasn't necessarily an invitation, if you will, from President Trump for President Zelenskyy to come to Washington last Friday. And then finally, I would just say, I think where the administration is at on this is that meeting on Friday was clearly going to be about the economic agreement. It was not going to be about security guarantees. And I think the administration feels that if you're going to talk about security guarantees and those other components of this, there's going to be a moment to do that. But I think the first step was to get to this agreement. Then from there, hopefully get to a ceasefire. And then from there, finally, I think the biggest component of this that the administration has been hammering home, in their view, is getting President Putin to the negotiating table. I think the administration feels very strong that the only way that this war ends is if President Putin comes to the negotiating table. I think that this is a war of attrition at the end of the day. And the real question is, how do you end it? And I think the administration's answer to that is getting President Putin to the negotiating table. And then finally, I would just say one other component of this is, look, President Trump did express frustrations with President Zelenskyy, but he's not the first U.S. president to do that. President Biden reportedly had expressed frustrations with President Zelenskyy. So, look, everyone's going to have an opinion on this. The big thing is what happens going forward here. And we'll see what European leaders do. It sounds like they're going to be putting together a proposal to present to President Trump. Let's see what happens with that.
Yeah, indeed. And I think the Russians will be looking very keenly to what happens next. We heard from the Kremlin, a spokesperson saying, what happened on Friday shows, quote, Western unity is starting to fall apart. I mean, that's, perhaps not the direction, is it, that President Trump wants things to go in?
Well, look, I think President Trump, as he mentioned during his meeting in the Oval Office with President Zelenskyy, the only nation he's aligned with is the United States. I think at the end of the day, President Trump is trying to deliver on the promise he made during the campaign trail, which was to end this war in a negotiated way. And I think, his view on this is that he is trying to do that, doing everything he can to do that. But there's steps to doing that. And again, this goes back to, I think the way that President Trump and many people on Capitol Hill view this is that, look, there's two different paths you can go down. One course is continuing to fund this war, which is a war of attrition. Or the other course is to see if you can get this war to come to an end in a peaceful manner in a negotiated way. Now, again, there's a lot that has to be done there. You got to get both Russia as well as, President Zelenskyy and the Ukrainian key leaders here to the negotiating table. And both sides have to feel as though their voices are heard on this. But at the end of the day, I think what President Trump is at on this is that he campaigned on an America First agenda. And I think he's going to be aligned with what's in the best interest of the United States, but at the same time recognizing that peace is needed in this conflict. I think he recognizes that this conflict needs to come to an end. And I think he would argue that he's doing everything he can to do that.
Sure. I mean, there's going to be concessions ideally on both sides. But up until this point, we've only heard concessions made on one side by this administration in Washington, namely that NATO membership is off the cards for Ukraine. The territorial gains made by Russia, well, they can hang on to what they've got. I mean, we haven't heard, unless I've missed it, a single concession made by the other side, have we?
Well, I think we have to see what happens here. I mean, I think the administration's arguments to that, I suspect, would be you have to let this process play out. You can't negotiate anything until you get the necessary parties to the negotiating table, I think is what President Trump and his team would argue on this. I think they are very clear, and they've been very transparent about where President Trump stands on this. President Trump himself has been very clear about where he stands on this. He's been clear about the issue of NATO. He's been clear about the United States' role in potential security guarantees. So all of this should not have been a surprise, I think, to President Zelenskyy, or to anybody. You can say what you want about President Trump, like him or not, agree with him or not. He's very transparent. He was in the Oval Office. He has been up in the lead up to that meeting. So right now, where it's at is, look, I think those who are analyzing the situation would suggest that Ukraine needs the United States, that the United States' funding abilities, military capabilities, all those things that have been aiding in this conflict is required for Ukraine to be successful. But at the end of the day, the question is, what is success? And I think many people looking at this, particularly Americans, you're seeing in the recent polling, over 70% of Americans want this war to come to an end. I think in the eyes of many Americans right now, getting this war to come to a peaceful resolution and end is the key. So look, to answer your question, I think we have to wait and see what happens with concessions, wait and see what happens with negotiation. But I think this administration has been very clear. You can't negotiate anything, any conflict, unless you get the necessary parties to the table. As you saw in Saudi Arabia, where the administration, key foreign policy leaders on behalf of President Trump were meeting with Russian individuals. I think at the end of the day, the administration is trying to get the necessary parties to the negotiating table. That, of course, includes President Putin.
Which should also include, presumably, President Zelenskyy as well. He said he's...
It should include both parties. I think the administration has been clear that they've been utilizing shuttle diplomacy, getting both President Zelenskyy to the table and President Putin. To be clear, you're absolutely correct. It should absolutely include both leaders, no question about that.
President Zelenskyy says he's willing to meet President Trump again. This is obviously subsequent to their dust-up on Friday. Do you think these two men can turn the page and now sign this deal and everyone moves on? What is your assessment?
We'll see. I think it's possible. I think anything's possible. I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to what does President Zelenskyy do? And what does President Trump do, of course? And where President Trump left it, in his words, was that, President Zelenskyy can come back when he's ready for peace. Now, that's the words of President Trump, and everyone's going to have their different views on that rhetoric, but that's where President Trump's stance is on this. And then I would say, look, the things I'd be watching for is what happens with the actual deal. In other words, is it going to be the same deal with the same terms that was presented to President Zelenskyy last week, or is it going to be a different deal with different terms? I think that's something that people should be watching for right now with what President Trump does. But at the end of the day, this was one component of this, not the final component of this. I think the administration saw this as get this deal done, which would be beneficial to Ukraine and the United States, which would also help provide its own right some security guarantees. And then from there, get to a ceasefire. And then from there, get both parties, President Zelenskyy and President Putin, to the negotiating table. We'll see if that's still the course that takes shape here. But at the end of the day, I go back to public perception in this, I do think matters as well. And I think the vast majority of Americans right now want this war to come to an end. You're seeing that in the data, in the polling out there. I think they recognize a lot of taxpayer funds have been paid for to this conflict, and they want to see a peaceful resolution. The real question is, how do you get there? And I think this administration has been underlining that negotiation is the key ultimately at the end of the day. I think to wait and see what happens with this agreement.
Do you see, this is my last question, but I mean, do you see perhaps, with this, war of words and the clear tension between these two presidents, Zelenskyy and Trump, that perhaps it's going to be better to allow other countries like the United Kingdom and like France that have demonstrated leadership on the diplomatic stage. Both of those countries' leaders were in the Oval Office before President Zelenskyy got there earlier on in the week. Do you see them as having the key role here and perhaps somehow trying to sort of, act as intermediaries, really?
I think President Trump has been clear that the European leaders will absolutely need to have a role in this. And whether that's with respect to security guarantees, that President Trump has been clear that European leaders should be the ones to take up. I mean, President Trump has been very clear on that. Or whether it's with at this stage right now where we're at, kind of to your point, serving as kind of the individuals in the middle here, trying to, if you will, get this deal potentially back on course, or if you will, bringing President Zelenskyy and President Trump together to discuss the components of what is next. I think ultimately what we saw throughout the past couple hours here was obviously key developments in this. And certainly that was European leaders meeting, discussing what their proposed plan could be here. But I think at the end of the day, the reality is that this is going to be a joint effort. I think President Trump has been clear about that. I think European leaders have been clear about that. Obviously we saw on Friday that there was some breakdown here. But let's see what happens here going forward. I think this will be a critical week coming up here. And then let's see what President Trump says tomorrow. President Trump is addressing members of Congress tomorrow night. Let's see what he says in that address as well as it relates to this conflict and President Zelensky and this deal. But look, to answer your question, absolutely, I think it's going to be a joint effort here. I think all leaders have recognized that that's going to be mission critical here in order to hopefully having success and peace at the end of the day here. Obviously, I think that's what's important to everybody here at the table.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Matt Terrell. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, at a London summit during the course of the weekend, European leaders pledged their full support to Kyiv. In addition, they committed to spending more on security, and they pledged to assemble a coalition to defend any truce in Ukraine. Well, the talks, hosted by the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, brought together 18 allies, and those talks came at a delicate moment as Ukraine faces uncertainty now over US support. Well, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that funding pledges from European leaders, which included a $2 billion air defense missile deal with the United Kingdom, will merely cause the war to drag on. However, after those talks in London with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and a dozen European leaders, the British Prime Minister said that the plan to bring peace to Ukraine will have US backing.
The whole point of a guarantee for any deal, or if there is a deal, is to preserve the peace. And if you want to preserve the peace, you have to be prepared to defend the peace. So the reason I've been forward-leaning on this is because I want to avoid conflict, because I do not want conflict in Ukraine, in Europe, and certainly not in the United Kingdom. The discussions we've had today, particularly the coalition of the willing, is on the basis that this is a plan that we will work with the US and that it will have US backing.
Well, let's get some more analysis, and we can speak to Sir Gerald Howarth, the former British Defence Minister who joins us from Suffolk in the United Kingdom. Sir Gerald, it's great to have you with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Just tell us what went through your mind on Friday evening as you watched events unfolding in the Oval Office.
Well, Tom, quite simply, utter horror and disbelief that the leader of the free world, the President of the United States of America, and his sidekick of a vice president should behave in such a puerile and preposterous manner and be so rude to a man who is fighting for his country's life. I just thought it was simply outrageous.
I mean, a lot of people in the Trump administration would immediately jump back and they'd say, look, Volodymyr Zelenskyy is disrespectful, he's ungrateful, he's risking World War III. That's all their lines to take. That's all their bullet points. How would you respond to that?
I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever to suggest that Zelenskyy and Ukraine have been ungrateful. Every Ukrainian I've spoken to has just poured out their thanks for all the support that has been given to them by their allies, which until the other day included the United States of America. So I simply don't understand that argument. I don't think he was disrespectful in the least. The fact that he went to the White House in his what has become his traditional black T-shirt, that's what he wears everywhere, and it's perhaps a symbol of the fact that he is a wartime leader. But of course, there's no understanding of history in the United States, I'm afraid, amongst many of our friends there. And of course, they won't remember that when Winston Churchill, as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the Second World War, visited the White House, he turned up in a siren suit. That was a sort of dungaree clothing which Churchill wore during the Second World War. So the idea that he was disrespectful by not wearing a suit, I think is just simply pathetic. But even if they did think that he should have worn a suit, that was no way to treat the man.
Yeah, well, it's what he wore for the King of England and what he wore for royalty in the past in the United Kingdom. And of course, Donald Trump was given a carrot only a day earlier on the Thursday by the visiting British Prime Minister in the form of that state visit. Some in the UK calling for that state visit to be axed. What's your opinion?
Well, I thought it was a a brilliant move. I mean, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is clearly a narcissist, but he loves the royal family. He loves all those things upon which the United States turned their back when they declared their independence 250 years ago. But I thought it was a smart move. I thought the king was extremely gracious, a word which, of course, the President of the United States would not understand. But I thought the king was extremely gracious in the way that he dealt with the situation and offered the Prime Minister that, if you like, olive branch. I don't think we should cancel it yet. There is time for the President of the United States to repent of his sin.
Yeah, I mean, the narrative from the United Kingdom hasn't changed, really, has it? I mean, we heard from the British Armed Forces Minister, Luke Pollard, saying, quote, "The war could stop tomorrow if President Putin stopped his illegal and unprovoked aggression." And we've got to a point here where the United States sees things through an entirely different prism. I mean, where's that come from?
It's very hard to understand. I contacted my friend in the United States a couple of years ago and said, why is it that our Republican friends, bearing in mind I'm conservative and we share a lot of the same political outlooks as the Republican Party of the United States, I said, why is it so many of our Republican friends in the United States are unwilling to support the Biden package of $66 billion of military aid to Ukraine? Bearing in mind that the Biden administration itself was extremely slow to respond to the calls made by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson that we needed to go to the aid of Ukraine. But nevertheless, why were there our Republican friends who surely understood the danger that Russia has posed for the last 80 years? Why should they not support that deal? And he came back to me and said, basically, they're ignorant. And I'm afraid that really sums it up. It's either that or an incredibly breathtaking naivety. The idea that you can take Putin's word for anything. He is an out and out liar. Ben Wallace, former Secretary of State for Defense, told me the other day when he met Gerasimov in Moscow just before the invasion, Gerasimov, the general, looked him in the eye and said, "We are not going to invade Ukraine." 3 days later, whatever it was, they invaded Ukraine. And the idea that the President of the United States is accusing Ukraine of starting the war. It wasn't Ukrainian tanks rolling into Moscow, Mr. President. As you can see on the television, it was Russian tanks rolling into Kyiv, which had it not been for the provision of our anti-tank weapon, the NLAW anti-tank weapon, which we had provided to Ukraine, would undoubtedly have succeeded in taking the capital as Putin had intended. And it's very important, Tom, that people in the Gulf should understand what is going on. This is not some kind of spontaneous outburst by Russia. In July 2021, Putin made a speech in which he said, Ukraine is part of Russia. This man has intended to do all he can to try to rebuild the old Soviet Union, because he, like so many Russians, resent the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. We failed to take notice of that. We failed in 2008 to take notice of the invasion of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. We failed to respond to the annexation by Russia of Crimea. We allowed them to take that with impunity. We've given them every possible green light. And now President Trump is giving a monstrous green light to Moscow. The idea that he would stop at any line drawn on the map in any so-called peace deal, I mean, it's just for the birds. Look at his behavior. Don't judge the man by what he says, judge the man by what he's done.
I know you're from a different party to the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, but I just want to get your assessment on how he's handled things the last sort of 4 or 5 days. I mean, European leaders really closing ranks on Sunday in support of Kyiv at that summit. The French president as well, very much involved. How do you think Sir Keir Starmer has handled all of this?
Well, I think he's handled it well. Yes, you're right. I am a member of the previous governing party, not of the current governing party, but it was a feature of the previous arrangement when we were in office that Sir Keir Starmer and his government supported what our government was doing in Ukraine. There was cross-party support then, and I'm very pleased to see that that cross-party support is being maintained today, not least by my son-in-law, who happens to be the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, James Cartledge. And I think that that is right. I think that he was faced with an impossible situation. What do you do with a president like President Trump? I mean, the temptation just to tell him, take a running jump, that his behavior is appalling, that he is the one risking a third world war, not Zelenskyy. But the temptation, sock him one in the eye, it must have been enormously difficult to resist, and not least bearing in mind all the comments made in the past by not only Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, but also his other ministers when they were in opposition, denouncing President Trump. So I thought he played a good hand. I think he's also played a good hand in respect of the European response. Paradoxically, our having left the European Union has given us a much stronger position. We don't have to negotiate with other EU allies to come to a conclusion. We can negotiate freely with other European friends, as Sir Keir Starmer did yesterday. And we can, as the leading defence nation in Europe, as a nuclear power, as one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, we have a role to play. And I am very pleased that Sir Keir Starmer seems to have recognised that and taken the initiative to bring our European friends together in London to try to forge some sort of policy to deal with this aberration of an American administration.
Yeah, rare praise from the other side of the political aisle there, Sir Gerald. Just want to ask you last of all, while we're talking about Europe, Europe is going to rearm, and we heard that from the European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen, saying that the continent has to urgently prepare for the worst. I'm just wondering what you think she means by that.
Well, the truth is, Tom, that all of us on this side of the pond have been utterly complacent for the best part of 40 years. We have relied upon the United States to provide us with cover. And the American taxpayer has borne an overwhelming proportion of the burden of defense expenditure to keep us all safe. We have been warned. We were warned by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister in 2014 that European members of NATO needed to step up to the plate. President Trump warned in his last administration, they needed to step up to the plate. They've failed to do so until more recently. But now it seems to me there is a very real recognition that the chips are now down and they really have got to rearm, and they have got to rearm fast, because if America is going to, we do not even know if America is going to walk away from NATO, which of course would be catastrophic, not just for us, of course, it would be catastrophic for America, because the signal it would send to Putin is that he can continue to do whatever he likes with impunity, it would embolden other dictators around the world. America would expose itself to greater international risk around the world. So the consequences for America will be just as great as they would for us. But we have got to ensure that rebuilding of European defense capability is done within the framework of NATO, not within the framework of the European Union. I was an EU defense minister. I sat around that table often in despair at their incompetence, whereas NATO has kept the peace in Europe this past 80 years, apart from what's happened in Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine was not a member of NATO. So NATO is a recognized framework. It is recognized, it is successful, what it has sought to achieve. and we must rebuild European defense capability through NATO. If I can just make one further point,
sure,
aside of the military side. I also find it deeply offensive for the President of the United States to try to strike some sort of grubby commercial deal with a country which is being bombed, whose civilians are being abducted into Russia, whose blocks of flats are being targeted by drones, that the President of the United States of America should be seeking a grubby deal under which he can extract minerals from that war-torn country in return for foreign aid. I just think it is absolutely appalling. The man seems to have absolutely no moral compass. And I know that friends in America do feel like this. A good friend of mine who is a serious defense commentator writing this morning talks about the betrayal of Ukraine. And I'm afraid, Mr. President, that is what you are in the process of doing. And in so doing, you are accelerating the risk of a third world war, for which you, I'm afraid, sir, will have to bear a very large part of the responsibility were that dreadful situation to develop.
Strong words to end on. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Sir Gerald Howarth, former British Defence Minister, always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Now turning our eye to events in the Middle East, and Palestinians in Gaza once again fear hunger and starvation during the holy month of Ramadan. This after Israel blocked all humanitarian aid into the enclave.
We all know that Karam Abu Salim is the crossing for goods into Gaza, and it's the month of Ramadan and Eid is coming. So this closure has caused prices to go up and forced many shops to close. More importantly, all the aid enters Gaza through this crossing. So its closure will affect many people who are waiting for it and whose daily sustenance depends on aid.
Closing the Karam Abu Salim crossing is closing Gaza's only lifeline, mainly for the entry of vegetables, fruits and food products. If the crossing is closed for one day, the price of vegetables skyrockets.
The closure of the crossing has a negative impact on our lives, on us as displaced people who have returned to Gaza. It's the month of Ramadan and we are in need of many things. My house was bombed and destroyed. I have nothing and there is nothing in Gaza. Everything is expensive and nothing is available.
So why has Israel made this decision? Well, Israeli officials say it's a strategy to pressure Hamas into agreeing to a US proposed plan for extending the ceasefire. Well, Israel is refusing to enter phase 2 of the ceasefire, which would eventually end the war. Instead, Israel insists on extending phase 1, which expired on Saturday. Well, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated that the extended truce would halt fighting until Ramadan, which finishes on the end of March, and the Jewish Passover holiday, which is on the 20th of April. Well, the truce would depend on Hamas releasing half of the hostages on the first day, with the remainder freed once a permanent ceasefire is agreed to.
Upon the conclusion of the first stage, and in light of Hamas's rejection of the Witkoff framework, we decided that the entry of goods and supplies into Gaza will be prevented. And it must be emphasized, Hamas currently controls all of the supplies and goods that are being sent to the Gaza Strip. It is abusing the Gazan population that is trying to receive the aid. It is shooting at them and is turning the humanitarian aid into a budget for terrorism directed against us. If Hamas continues to stick to its position and does not release our hostages, there will be additional consequences.
The Israeli Prime Minister speaking there. Well, let's get the latest on the ground in Gaza. We can speak to UNICEF spokesperson Salim Owais, who joins us now from Khan Yunis. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. This aid blockade, of course, risks triggering some serious humanitarian consequences. Just tell us, what does this mean for the people of Gaza?
Well, it really means going back in time to a time where aid was not well, it's not enough anyway, but it was really scarce, that we couldn't really reach the children and families that we've reached during the ceasefire. During the ceasefire, we really expanded our response. We scaled up our aid delivery, and when we did that, it wasn't enough yet. Now we come to a point where no aid is entering, despite months of appealing and advocacy to actually get more aid in. So this is really devastating on the humanitarian level. We're talking about people who have been cut off for months, people who don't have any income for months. Goods in the market, while they've increased during the ceasefire, the prices are very high for many people. Aid in all its forms, life-saving aid. We're talking about vaccines. We're talking about medical supplies, water pumping equipment and supplies. All that will be halted, meaning children and families will suffer even more for a longer period of time.
Just to be clear here, the situation was already dire, wasn't it, before this latest announcement?
Exactly. Maybe the world has heard a ceasefire and as if the situation has resolved. No, a ceasefire was just a start for something that we hope to be better. People were back to their original houses and places, only to find it demolished, only to find it destroyed. Basic services, even those who had their houses there, there's no water, there's no electricity. Everything is in ruins, literally and figuratively. They're really struggling to get ends to meet. And now, on top of that, we are blocking again the aid from getting in. And for us as humanitarian sector, we've been struggling to keep up with the humanitarian need. And even during ceasefire, again, it wasn't enough. It was better, but it wasn't enough. And that's why it's catastrophic now if we stop it, because we will not be able to continue our work as we want to, as we should to, in this new circumstances.
Yeah, and of course, we always hear, and this is something we often discuss when speaking to UNICEF representatives, that it's children that bear the brunt of conflict. And there's evidence of that, isn't there, with newborn infants dying of hypothermia because there isn't adequate shelter there in Gaza. I mean, just give us a sense of what sort of quantity of supplies remain at your disposal. How long will it be until UNICEF's supplies start to run out altogether?
Well, it's hard to tell. It depends on the supply, because the vaccines, it's something that we do every day for routine vaccinations, water pumping and repairs of the water system. We didn't even, we did some, but we didn't get much in. Tents and shelters for us and other agencies has been something that we were working on. So each supply, each let's say category of supply is different in terms of how far it will last. But what we really know is each day that we stop them, more people will suffer. If it's not from lack of shelter, it's because of lack of medical supplies. If it's not medical supplies, then water and other basic needs that they have already been suffering from. And as you said, children are dying from preventable causes. And without the aid, they will continue, unfortunately. And we are afraid that that number will increase. Only last week, we lost 7 children to hypothermia. So just stopping the aid is not an option. It shouldn't be an option.
Sure. And I just wondered, what's UNICEF calling for here? Because, of course, you're not a political organization. You're part of the United Nations. What would you like both sides to do?
Well, while politicians and parties of the conflict try to figure this out, we need to remember the children and families on the ground. We need to remember that these children and these families will not survive if we continue with depriving them from their basic rights. And aid is a right. It's really not a luxury. It's not something that we are giving them extra. This should continue. For UNICEF, the most important thing is a continued, sustained ceasefire. That's the main ask until we reach continuous and lasting agreement. And then the aid has always been something that we ask for, and now more than ever that should be heard.
Just lastly, I'm wondering what this news has done to morale. I mean, clearly people there have had a roller coaster in Gaza of emotions, with some sense of optimism perhaps surrounding the ceasefire process, and now a setback. What's that done to morale for people living in Gaza?
Well, I've been speaking to people from our colleagues who are from Gaza, to people on the streets, people in camps, doctors and different aid providers. Everyone is worried. Everyone is very, very anxious because they think that they've seen the worst of it. But now, with this aid halt, they're afraid that they will go back to those very dark days that they've been through. And I think people are tired. People are ready to go home and rebuild their lives. And for them, every time a complication happens on the political level, on the military level, it will just delay their dreams and make the hope even dimmer than it is right now.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. We wish you and UNICEF all the very best with your work there. Salim Owais, spokesperson for UNICEF, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, let's get some more analysis on the situation and the politics surrounding it. We can speak to Professor Kamal Hawash, a Palestinian academic and analyst who joins us from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Professor, it's great to have you with us once again. We were just hearing there about the really the catastrophic consequences of this announcement for people who live in Gaza, already living in dire conditions. Clearly, this is going to exacerbate what was already a dire situation.
Thank you for having me. Well, let's go back to basics. There was an agreement that Israel signed and Hamas signed. By all counts, Hamas has absolutely adhered to the agreement, but Israel has not, particularly on the humanitarian part of this agreement, in that it has not allowed tents and homes to be brought in. It hasn't allowed machinery, construction machinery, to be brought in. And now it has sealed the Gaza Strip, effectively cutting it off from the world, from any aid that it can receive, medical, humanitarian, and so on. And it is therefore deliberately, as was clear from the early stages of this aggression, it is targeting not Hamas, it is targeting the Palestinian people. However, I've seen lots of different videos. People, yes, are worried, but they are resilient. They all speak about rebuilding their homes as far as they can. This not only doesn't augur well for the humanitarian situation, but pushes back the prospect of reconstruction, which, again, Israel cannot be trusted to enable.
I mean, this truce came into effect on the 19th of January, which I think is about 42 days ago. Up until this point, well, let's say up until Sunday, had it been largely successful in achieving its objectives?
I think it has on the Israeli side, in that they have had all the prisoners that were said to be freed. It hasn't for the Palestinians. At various points, Netanyahu and his extremist government intervened to stop the release of the last batch of Palestinian prisoners. It has been sending them outside Palestine when the natural place for the prisoners to go is to go back to their homes. And it has stopped if you like, the resettlement of people into temporary homes until they are able to rebuild their actual homes. These people have deeds to land that they want to clear and then to rebuild. So although from the point of view of the agreement holding, it has on the Palestinian side, it has not on the Israeli side. And that is something that it feels emboldened to do, because the Americans stand with it, and they can rely on the Americans to say what they want them to say, and then they say, but the Americans have set these conditions and we want to go along with them. That is just simply not true. The Americans, yes, support Israel, but it is Netanyahu and his group that sent to the Americans their demands, which the Americans turn into their initiative. As if the Americans have any interest in the well-being of the Palestinian people. So the Palestinians have stood firm on adhering to the agreement. The Israelis have not.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the Trump administration's made it very clear what it wants to see happen to Gaza. They want to see it owned by the United States, flattened and rebuilt on US terms, and 2 million people resettled. I assume that means people in Gaza and perhaps in the West Bank as well have absolutely zero faith and zero trust in this new administration in Washington.
I think that's absolutely the case. How can someone who is the president of the United States come out and say that people can be moved like cattle, expelled? They're not resettled, they are expelled from their homeland, so that he and his property tycoon colleagues can start rebuilding Gaza in the image of what he refers to as a, if you like, an oasis in the Middle East, a Riviera, as he called it. Who is he? This is another people's land. It isn't his, and it doesn't belong to Israel. And even when he was talking about buying the land, who was he going to buy it from? Israel doesn't own it. It's the Palestinians who own it, and they don't want to sell. Just like they resist selling properties in the West Bank, particularly in Jerusalem, the Palestinians have an unbreakable attachment to the land, unlike the Israeli settlers from the north of Israel, who had to move during the interaction between Israel and Hezbollah, and still haven't returned. As soon as the Palestinians were able to get across the Netzarim corridor, they went back to their home in northern Gaza. And that is an absolutely clear sign of their attachment to their homeland. No Trump, no Netanyahu will push them out. If they try, they will find a great deal of resistance by ordinary people, and they will fail.
What do you think that whole plan and the fact that, you know, pretty much every Arab leader in the region rejected it outright, what do you think that plan says about the level of Washington and this new administration's understanding of this admittedly extremely complex and decades-old conflict?
They try to make it complicated, but it isn't. At a very basic level, and I acknowledge not everybody agrees to this, i.e. Palestinians, there's a two-state solution planned that the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza are Palestinian, that Israel ends the occupation and a Palestinian state emerges. That's actually pretty simple, but Israel continues to settle its people illegally in what are war crimes in Palestinian areas. Americans supported in doing that, both private and governments, in what it wants to achieve. It wants to change the whole status of Palestine. Particularly, the West Bank will no longer be referred to as the West Bank, but as Judea and Samaria by the American administration. Why can't they just take a step back and say there are 7 million Palestinians, 7 million Jewish Israelis, neither is going anywhere, and therefore let's find a solution that will accommodate their rights so that they can have equal rights. There cannot be Jewish supremacy in this equation that the Palestinians will accept. They can only accept being treated as human beings and for the human rights to be delivered in full. The refugees returning, and the Israelis will find that the best people to have as their neighbors are the Palestinian people, in fact.
Okay, and just lastly, because we're almost out of time, I want to ask you what happens next from the situation we're in right now. We've heard the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi saying there will be an urgent Arab summit in Cairo on Tuesday. I'm just wondering where you see that heading and where you see this situation regarding the ceasefire heading to overall.
First of all, tomorrow, I hope that the leaders will reaffirm their rejection of anything that would imply that they accept the expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland, that they will insist that Israel adheres to the plan that was, the agreement that was signed, that aid goes back, all types of aid as required, that that is the best way of Israeli prisoners being released and Palestinian prisoners being released, and that the reconstruction, they must insist that it is something that the Palestinians are in charge of through a government that presides both over Gaza and the West Bank. And once that happens, the reconstruction happens, they will also need to, which as it happens, Hamas agrees it will not be ruling in Gaza in the future. And that's the best way forward. We get to a peaceful stage, and after that, proper negotiations, not a peace process, proper negotiations on ending this conflict can commence fully. And that will be for the best, not only of Israelis, Palestinians, but also of the region itself.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Kamal Hawash. Thank you very much. Always great speaking to you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
We go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
New York, the Big Apple, the city that never sleeps. The most exciting in the world, New York, New York. Filled with restaurants, bars, museums, shopping destinations, and iconic sites, New York is indeed a welcoming city. A year-round destination with 4 seasons, New York is magical in the winter, with marvelous snowfalls and cloudless skies. In the spring and autumn, the city is at its best, with a crispness to the air and clear blue skies. The city is indeed filled with popular tourist spots. The most popular site is the Central Park, which transforms into a beautiful golden red in October. The Grand Central Terminal is known for its stunning historical feats. From its near destruction and restoration, the beauty of this famous Beaux Arts building is certainly a must-see. The Empire State Building, with its classic Art Deco architecture, is indeed a New York City icon. Its 102-story building is one of the most visited in the world. Visit the 86th floor outside Observatory for views of up to 80 miles or 130 kilometers that are definitely worth the photos. The Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, the world's largest performing arts center, is also home to 12 resident arts organizations, including the New York Philharmonic, Metropolitan Opera, the New York City Opera, and the New York City Ballet. Not to be missed are the world-class museums, the American Museum of Natural History, the Museum of Modern Art, and of course, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Times Square is yet another tourist spot to visit. In the middle of the bustling hive of activity, Times Square is known for its huge electronic billboards and many destinations for fun and activities. And finally, the reason why New York is called the city that never sleeps. The place offers endless nightlife options to choose from that makes it almost impossible to have time for sleep. There are after-dark nightclubs, bars, theaters, live music and comedy performances to explore every day, be it the weekend or a night after work. New York is also known as the restaurant capital of the world. With more than 18,000 eateries to choose from, just imagine how difficult deciding where to eat will be. The most expensive but worthy dining hangouts can be found in Midtown Manhattan, where reservations at restaurants are actually the standard.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Your Royal Highness, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gamble.
We've just heard a highly controversial speech from the new Vice President, J.D. Vance. What's your take?
As an observer who has been a fan of the American experience and experiment, I think America can be more friendly to the rest of the world and engage with them on that basis. It's not a matter that people want to take advantage of America's niceness, because America has always held itself for its interests very bravely and very strongly. So I think a little bit of smile and not necessarily a hug, but definitely an embracing attitude towards others.
You think it was a bit abrasive then?
Well, not so much abrasive as not sounding nice.
Yeah. Do you think that that room felt a sense of disquiet?
Absolutely. And when there was clapping, there was very little clapping. And I don't know if anybody felt like I felt, but definitely it was a signal that his words did not get the clapping that maybe he expected or that he wanted.
Did you
and
hear?
I don't think he wanted clapping.
Did you hear some truth, perhaps harsh truths?
Well, when he's addressing Europe, all of us have truths about Europe. The fact that it is divided, the fact that it is not playing the role that it should be playing, the fact that they're not spending as much on defense and things like that. We all agree on that. So I agree with him on that, definitely.
Tell me this, when you think about what happens next with regards to the Middle East, also a sense of serious disquiet. We've heard very little from the Arab foreign ministers that are here on the ground in Munich, so far at least. In your mind, are they any closer to finding an alternative plan for Gaza?
I'm sure. And I'm surprised that not just about Gaza, but the whole Palestinian issue. When people say that, well, we presented a plan from America, there are no alternatives to it. The place is full of alternatives. There is the Arab Peace Initiative. That's a very comprehensive alternative that will take into account a final ending to the conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbor. On Gaza, as I understood from newspaper accounts and statements from officials, there were talks about the day after engaged with America and with Europe and other players in the area that were suddenly, abruptly confronted with Mr. Trump's ethnic cleansing plan. So that, to me, is a surprise.
Yeah. The argument from the administration is that on October 7th, Americans died, and Americans should not be unsafe anywhere in the world. And beyond that, neither should U.S. allies. How can Saudi Arabia bridge that gap, bridge that conversation?
Well, I wish Americans would also keep in mind that before October 7th and since October 7th, the people who died most were the Palestinians with American weapons. So if there is going to be a quid pro quo, Americans died and Palestinians died and so on, we're never going to end the situation and reach a final solution. I think we should look forward to the future. Now October 7th is behind us. Now we have to go forward. Mr. Trump's plan is not selling anywhere. So the alternative is either go back to the Arab Peace Initiative, or they can think of doing Gaza along with the Marshall Plan in Europe after the Second World War. America rebuilt the whole continent, let alone the small strip of Gaza, while the people stayed in place. They didn't move the Europeans out of Europe in order to build that. So they can do it very well in Gaza.
When you think about what's going to happen next, there are a lot of questions about what that potential alternative plan can be. Given the weaknesses that you mentioned that are happening here in Europe, do you anticipate that Europe and the Arab states could come up with a plan together?
They already have, as you know, the Alliance for the Two-State Solution. That is a European and an Arab combination. And I know that they've been working with the US and with the United Nations in order to formulate what can be a more peaceful outlook and result of discussions after October 7th. So give them a chance at least. Let them see, what they can do. But so far, this preempting and unilaterally making declarations is not helpful.
Yeah. Tell me this. Is there anything about the Trump administration that you've seen so far that has been good for the Arab world?
Well, what I can say is that, Mr. Trump has had experience with us from the first term. He said he wants to visit the area, and I would encourage him to do that. And he wants to have more engagement, let's say, with Saudi Arabia. He just announced a summit between him and Mr. Putin in Riyadh. That is something that the kingdom has already welcomed. So that is a good sign. Yeah. And I think he can take advantage of the position, not just of Saudi Arabia, but of the Arab and Muslim world in the world, to make the world a better place.
Do you think that the situation with Palestine can be resolved in a similar summit in Riyadh?
Why not? Why not? Yeah.
Your Royal Highness, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Ms. Gamble.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hi Scott, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. So we're here at the Festival of Golf. As you can hear, it's all lively in the background. The LIV season opener in Riyadh. What are your expectations for this weekend?
Well, first starts with fun and probably ends with families. And so having our first round last night, which was so exciting, it is my first LIV event. And just to walk the course and see people smiling, you might hear the music in the background. We have music playing, we have DJs in our neon forest. And we have a fan zone that's to the likes I've never seen before. And the Backstreet Boys are playing tonight. So, I mean, when are you going to come to a golf tournament? See the greatest stars in the world. You got DJ, you got Brooks Koepka, Bryson DeChambeau, Waco Neiman. I mean, it is a who's who of golf and pretty fun.
There's something for everyone, as you said, at the Backstreet Boys. I know a lot of the non-golf fans who are here are looking forward to that as well. There's also another first here. The tournament is being played under lights. What was the inspiration for that?
Well, we have an incredible leader in His Excellency, Yasser Al-Rahman, and he thought, hey, what an incredible opportunity to play at night. It'd be the first time it's ever been done before. We're in Riyadh, which is wonderful for television back in the US. You might know we have a new deal with Fox, so it puts the broadcast times in the right zone. it gives the players kind of an opportunity to test and try something new. And we have stars in this league that want to do something different. And I think it gives us an opportunity to showcase innovation, do something new and fun, and hit some broadcast windows in the US that are helpful.
Of course, absolutely, and we'll get to that point on Fox in a moment. So here it is, it's growing as a golf hub. What is the main driver behind that? Obviously, LIV is hugely involved in this. Where do you see the game growing over the next 5 years?
Well, there are so many incredible golf projects in the kingdom. I mean, you have Darija Gate, the project Greg Norman designed. You have what's happening in Qadiyah with those 2 beautiful courses down there. And it was just with a gentleman from Neom, which seems like that's going to be incredible too. So first off, it starts with the quality of golf courses. You clearly have commitment in this market. They continue to showcase, as we have here, a spectacular golf course and continuing the fandom to build. And I think that momentum is really going to help us for the next 5 years.
Absolutely. What are your favorite aspects of the LIV model? Obviously, like we've got the music here behind, the team aspect. Why do you think that is growing at such a fast rate in comparison with the PGA? Average age of the fans in the PGA is in the 60s. The average age of LIV fans is now in the 30s. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite aspect is the team aspect. I was with Sergio Garcia yesterday having lunch, and he was talking about how passionate he was about helping his guys, Luis and Puig and Abraham, kind of emerge and develop. I mean, and that to me is the specialness of this model. You have the greats of the game with an opportunity to kind of carry forward this next generation and help them emerge, not only as professionals and elite golfers, but also as human beings. And I think that's what brings me the most joy.
And kind of speaking about the human being aspect, I was lucky enough to walk the course behind Bryson DeChambeau last night, at Cameron Smith, at Dustin Johnson. These guys are just incredible.
You can't believe how athletic they are, right?
Yeah.
Like Bryson's drives, DJ's raw athleticism, and Cam's short game, you actually got to see it all. Like, that is the best of the best on display.
Yes, and that is why, so like in terms of viewership, obviously you're competing against the PGA. As you mentioned earlier, you've just signed the deal with Fox as well as ITV in the UK.
It's a wonderful deal.
You're really starting to compete now for viewership with the PGA. This must be very exciting.
Yeah, I prefer like kind of co-opetition. I mean, I think all of us in the golf ecosystem, a rising tide lifts all boats. I don't think we're getting anywhere near scratching the surface in terms of the opportunity we have to drive more fans, golfers and non-golfers alike, into this golf family. Our household viewership opportunity in the 100 countries where we're broadcast is almost 800 million homes.
Wow.
And so, so we have such opportunity ahead and such good momentum so far. And I'm rooting for the PGA Tour to do really well. I'm rooting for the DP Tour to do really well. And LIV is what I'm really passionate about.
And you yourself have had an incredible career, obviously, in the States. You've managed some of the biggest sports franchises in the world. What fundamentals from managing those are you going to bring into LIV to help further the game for LIV?
Well, the fundamentals are very similar. If you look at the business model here, it's TV. And so we've made some good progress as of late. We have a ways to go, but incredible progress with Fox and ITV, among others around the world. Our sponsorship base, if you don't have to look too far, then over my right shoulder to see Madden come in as one of the top. It's one of the 6 largest mining company in the world with a world-class CEO. Riyadh Air, Roshan, and our good friends in Bahrain. So we have a great sponsorship base, and that's going to have to continue to grow around the world. But we've had such incredible support from the region here, which has been great. And then, look, we need more people coming. We need more people watching, reading, wearing our merchandise. Get this vest at a store near you, and experiencing this incredible hospitality. So I would just encourage you to give it a try. If you have a chance to come out and see a LIV event, it is probably like no event you've ever been to in your life. It is fun, it's engaging, it's family friendly, and you get to see more stars than you see in any constellation in the sky.
Agreed about that. It was incredible last night. So you have come into LIV at somewhat of an interesting time. Obviously, there's a lot of talk of allegiances with the PGA as well as the DP World Tour. Are you the man to achieve that goal? Is that something you want?
This is not, it never has been, never will be, it never could be about any one person. This is This is led by our incredible chairman. We have an incredible staff, and we have a golf industry that, as they say, inshallah, is actually pulling together and wanting to do what's best for the game of golf, to grow the game of golf, to come together and to make sure that everywhere around the world, golf fans are satisfied with what they're getting in terms of coverage and access to events.
President Donald Trump has recently met with the PGA Commissioner, as well as Adam Scott, who also works for the PGA, to discuss a potential merger. There has been a lot of talk about this. Donald Trump has said on his campaign trail that in 15 minutes and one phone call, he could get a deal done. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are that if the leader of the free world is spending his time on golf, I am very happy. This game matters. It's one of the great life teachers in the world. It gives values that this world needs more of right now. It brings us together with connectivity. It gets us outside. It gets our phones in our pockets. It teaches us integrity and resilience and consistency, all things we all need to be successful in this world. And if there's commitment from all sides to bring the game together, which is good for the game of golf, I couldn't be happier.
Have you spoken with Trump?
I have not.
Okay,
but we are playing at his golf course in Miami in a few weeks. So you know.
And he is a fantastic golfer, obviously, with kind of break 50 with Bryson, who's obviously doing huge numbers online. That's been incredible to watch. Yeah. Another point, the US Championship announced on Wednesday that it will accept players from LIV. This is a huge coup, isn't it?
Well, I don't know if it's a coup. The RNA announced this similarly today. So for the Open Championship, we'll see the same in Northern Ireland this year. So very exciting. For us, is, you know, when you look at, when you consider the majors, the biggest stage in the world for the biggest stars in the world, and that's obviously the Masters at Augusta and the PGA of America, PGA Championships, and then the US Open and the Open Championships. They want the best stars in the world, and we have quite a few of them. And so I think when there's an opportunity to put those two things together, good things will happen. And we're really pleased and grateful and appreciative of this, you know, the olive branch and the step forward. We've got great leaderships in the organizations that matter, and we're thrilled to be a part of it.
I'll just end on quickly. Do you have a favorite golfer who plays elsewhere that you would like to see in LIV?
No. I have one favorite golfer. That's my father-in-law. I have to love him for something.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to seeing him on the course soon.
Okay, good. You will soon.
Thanks so much, Scott. A pleasure.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs,